You wake before the roosters call, in the faint blue stillness that sits between night and day. The thatched roof above you has kept the cold at bay, but only just the air that brushes your cheek carries the kind of chill that seeps in quietly. Outside, the courtyard is hushed, save for the slow crunch of straw sandals on packed dirt. Someone is already moving among the clay jars. You slide the paper door aside and step into the cool morning. The smell reaches you before the sight, an earthy, sharp blend of cabbage, garlic, and something deeper, a scent that seems to hum in your nose. It is the scent of months of patience, of vegetables transformed by time. Across the courtyard, a woman in layered hemp cloth lifts the heavy clay lid from a wide-bellied jar. The lid makes a low, resonant sound as it settles against the wall. Beneath it, a pale sheen of condensation clings to the jar's inner lip. The ground here is uneven, worn smooth where generations have walked between house and cellar. Beside each jar, thin mats of straw lie folded, ready to be spread for insulation once the sun is higher. A small wooden stool leans against the largest jar, its surface faintly stained by years of salt and spice. You notice a child sitting nearby, his hands wrapped around a warm bowl of barley tea, watching the woman work as if the lifting of lids were a performance worth rising early to see. A drop of brine runs down the jar's outer wall and falls into the dirt, darkening it to a rich brown. You kneel, running your fingertips over the jar's surface. The pottery is cool and slightly rough, made in a nearby kiln where potters stamp their marks on the shoulders before firing. You remember hearing that the first kimchi cellars like this date back over 1,000 years, though the chilies were only added centuries later, arriving from far-off lands by uncertain routes. The woman catches you looking and smiles faintly. She dips a wooden paddle into the jar, turning the cabbage leaves slowly, checking for air pockets. Historians still argue whether this careful rotation was always part of the process or a later refinement. The child leans forward, breathing in the scent as though it were the morning's only true meal. You stand, brushing the cool dirt from your hands, and the day feels as though it will move at the pace of the jars, unhurried, patient, guided more by the rhythm of fermentation than by the hours on the water clock. The path to the communal cellar begins just beyond the gate, where the courtyard narrows into a strip of packed dirt. The edges are lined with woven reed fences, their pale stalks weathered by wind and rain. You walk slowly, feeling the uneven give of the ground beneath your feet. A faint frost still lingers in the shadows, catching in the woven pattern of the reeds. Here, the air shifts. The scent of the open courtyard fades, replaced by the darker, earthier smell of buried things, not unpleasant, but older, as though the soil itself has been storing its own quiet memory. Above the fence line, you glimpse roof lines and smoke from other households. Somewhere, a rooster calls belatedly, as though startled by the morning. The path is only wide enough for one person at a time. You step aside as an older man approaches from the opposite direction, balancing a covered basket on his hip. His breath comes in visible puffs, and his layered hemp jacket rustles as he passes. You hear the faint slosh of liquid inside the basket, perhaps brine, perhaps rice wash, and he nods in greeting without breaking his stride. Every few paces, the fence is interrupted by small bundles of twigs tied with hemp cord. They mark the property lines of the families who share the cellar, though no one here seems to need reminding of which jars belong to whom. At one bend in the path, a low clay platform holds 3 small jars, each with its lid tied down by a cross of reed rope. You notice the lids are flecked with red chili powder dusted by the wind, and one jar has a faint crack running down its side, repaired with a line of resin. You pause beside a bundle of drying garlic hanging from the fence. Its skins are papery and whisper against each other in the breeze. You recall hearing that garlic was once considered both food and medicine here, though whether it was always paired with cabbage and kimchi is still a matter of debate among scholars. Some say the pairing was inevitable. Others insist it was an innovation born of necessity. As you walk, you notice that the ground slopes gently downward, hinting at the cellar's location below the village's main path. The sound of your sandals on dirt is steady, matched by the slow creak of the fence in the morning air. You think about how many seasons these reeds have stood here, replaced piece by piece, holding the path in place like a frame around a painting. Ahead, the path curves, and a darker shadow spreads across the ground, the sign that you are near the cellar's mouth. You slow your steps, letting the cold air roll toward you from the earth below. Somewhere ahead, a jar lid is lifted, and the sound, low, hollow, and ancient, drifts up to meet you. The stone steps appear where the earth opens, a mouth cut neatly into the mound beside the path. You pause at the lip, letting the breath of the cellar rise to meet your face, a steady exhale, cool and faintly salted, as if the ground has kept a quiet sea for you. Moss lies in thin seams between the stones, the green dulled by frost. You set your hand to the first slick edge and begin to descend. The light thins with each footfall. Above you, the woven fence becomes a pale lattice. Below you, the passage narrows to the width of 2 shoulders and a jar carried sideways. The steps are not uniform. They were cut by memory more than measure. Some are shallow and wide, others close together like the rungs of a ladder turned to stone. You learn their rhythm: heel, toe, pause, breathe until the air grows so still that your breath sounds louder than your steps. There is a smell you can name in layers: the sour sweet of cabbage tamed by salt, the mellowing bite of garlic, the damp mineral of clay that has held winter after winter. Your fingers trail the wall and come away cool and dusty. Somewhere ahead, a drop of water lets go and strikes stone, a small note that hangs in the silence longer than it should. At a low lintel, the steps end. Someone has tied a narrow chrysanthemum stem to the post, dried now, its petals the color of old straw. You have seen such stems pressed over doorway lintels before, a wish for calm and clean flavor. Whether this habit has always been kept in cellars or rose from a season of worry about jars turning, historians still argue. The record leaves more silence than speech. You step into the chamber. The floor meets you flat and cold. Here stand the onggi, shoulder to shoulder, their brown skins a quiet shine where lamplight touches. Each jar is buried to its hip so that winter cannot startle the contents with sudden cold. This practice, seating jars in earth to keep them temperate through long frost, is older than the chilies themselves. A memory from centuries when kimchi meant salt and leaf and thyme, and not yet the red fire that later traveled inland. You rest your palm on the nearest jar. The clay holds a faint warmth that belongs to slow change. A lid sits over it like a fitted cap, rim to rim, and a cross of reed cord keeps it sure. Near the seam lies a small pebble, smooth and black. It is used as a knock, a gentle tapper to listen for hollows that might mean air slipped in where it should not. Some cellar keepers claim they can hear the difference between a jar that is content and a jar that frets. Whether the ear is that wise or the heart helps it along is a question no one agrees on. You kneel and tilt your ear. The jar hums in its own way, not like music, but like a place busy while pretending to be still. Tiny bubbles rise along the hidden leaves and seek the edge, then soften against the lid with the faintest kiss. The cellar holds them, keeps their secrets, and gives nothing away but a cool breath. You lift a lid with careful hands. The inner rim is ringed with a thin line of white salt, a drawn barrier. The surface beneath gleams like melted glass. Between the folds of cabbage, red threads of paste lie quiet. You touch the brine to the back of your hand and taste. It is clean, with the blunt roundness of sea salt hauled from coast to village in heavy sacks. The use of sea salt in these cellars is a steady practice, a link between inland kitchens and tide, and as old as the need to keep vegetables sound through winter. In the corner stands a tall jar with an old scar down its side, mended with clay stitched by thin reeds. The repair has darkened into a seam that looks almost like a deliberate design. A small straw charm hangs from its neck, 3 knots and a single chili stem, sun-dried to the color of brick. 2 families say a grandmother tied it there to keep the jars from quarreling. Whether the charm had any part in a season of good flavor, or whether careful hands did all the work, no one proves. The charm remains. Beneath your feet, the floor bears circles where jars once stood in other winters, faint marks smoothed by countless sweepings. You imagine how many hands have measured out salt, how many shoulders have leaned to shift a heavy belly of leaves, how many breaths have tested the air for trouble. A common account tells that red pepper arrived from distant shores in the late 16th century and moved inland by markets and caravans, not all at once, but in a tide that reached one valley, then another. Exactly when each valley welcomed the fire is still argued in kitchens and in books. You replace the lid you lifted and listen once more. In this half-light, your hearing reaches farther than your eyes. The cellar is not silent. It speaks in the soft drift of cool air, in the distant plink of water, in the slow answer of clay settling against earth. The steps back up will come soon enough, but for a moment, you stand with the jars, sharing the stillness that is not still at all. At last you turn toward the stairs. The lamp near the lintel flickers. Its small flame clings to its wick like a stubborn leaf in wind. You look back once at the rows of brown shoulders, each jar a quiet house with its door shut, each keeping for winter more than food. The rhythm of work, the promise careful things hold, the patient taste of time. Rows of onggi jars stretch before you like a small earthen city. They stand in long lines, their broad shoulders and narrow waists giving them the shape of people, hunched in quiet conversation. The lids rest snug and still, each one a shallow dome of clay that has learned to bear the weight of seasons. The light from the oil lamp grazes their surfaces, catching where the glaze swells over a subtle ridge or dips into a fingerprint left by the potter. You step between the rows, your sandals pressing softly into the packed clay floor. The air is cooler here, shaded by the earth above, and it holds the steady scent of salt, spice, and cabbage in mid-change. Between two jars, you notice a scrap of straw caught on the cord that binds a lid. Its pale fiber is damp from the cellar's slow breathing. You think of how these cords, twisted from reed or hemp, are replaced each autumn before the first frost, their fibers still fresh enough to resist fraying through the long winter. As you pass, your fingertips brush the jar's flanks. They are not perfectly smooth. Each carries the texture of the potter's hands, faint spirals from the turning wheel, and small dimples where wet clay was coaxed into its final form. The marks are not decoration so much as memory, proof that the jar began as earth and water before becoming a keeper of flavor. Some say these handmade jars know the food they hold, as if the unevenness of their skin somehow makes the fermentation more alive. Whether this is superstition or a truth only the tongue can prove, historians still write notes in the margins without conclusion. You pause at a row of shorter jars, their bellies plump and their shoulders closer to your waist. The lids are tied with thinner cord, and small tags of wood hang from them, marked in brushstroke with the season's name or a family sign. It is said that these rows belong to households with fewer mouths to feed, or to those who keep special recipes apart from the shared stores. One jar's lid is flecked with dried chili paste that must have splashed there in a careless moment, now set like paint in the clay's surface. The path between the rows is just wide enough for two people to pass shoulder to shoulder. A low wooden bench sits at the far end, worn to a soft sheen. It is here that cellar keepers sometimes rest between the work of lifting, sealing, and checking. Today the bench holds a folded length of cloth and a small wooden paddle tools set aside mid-task, their edges stained red from years of use. You crouch beside a jar in the center row and run your fingers along the thin gap where lid meets rim. The cord is pulled tight in a cross, each end knotted with care. A layer of clay seals the edge, smooth and unbroken. This sealing method, clay over cord, is not used in every village, and its origins are uncertain. Some suggest it began in wetter climates to keep out excess moisture. Others believe it was simply a way to keep curious hands from lifting a lid too soon. In the dim light, the jars seem to lean slightly toward each other, as if sharing warmth. The arrangement is deliberate, rows facing inward, so that the narrow spaces between them trap the cellar's steady temperature. This design has been passed down without written record, surviving in the quiet repetition of hands placing jars where they will best endure. A cat slips silently between the rows, tail high, its steps soft as falling ash. It pauses to press its cheek against the curve of a jar before moving on. You watch it vanish into shadow, thinking how this place belongs not only to people but to all creatures who value warmth and shelter. At the far wall, a bundle of dried chili stems hangs from a peg. The stems are brittle, and their seeds rattle faintly when touched by a draft. They are not here for use. Their time in the kitchen is past, but as a reminder of the season when the chilies came in from the fields, bright and sharp before the frost dulled their fire. You stand in the center of the rows, closing your eyes for a moment. The cellar is not silent. It breathes through the faintest sounds, the slow creak of cord adjusting under tension, the almost imperceptible fizz within the jars, the quiet drop of water finding the floor. This chorus, too soft to command attention, shapes the cellar's character as much as its scent. When you open your eyes again, the jars are simply jars, their quietness complete. You move on, each step a soft thud on the earthen floor, the rows of brown shoulders passing by like a slow procession. Above your head, the lamp's flame wavers, and the air smells of salt and thyme. The sharp scent of fermentation greets you more fully as you step deeper into the cellar's still air. It is not a single smell, but a layered one: cabbage, softened by weeks in brine; garlic, mellowed yet still insistent; the faint warmth of ginger, and the deep mineral saltiness of the sea condensed into crystals. You breathe in slowly, letting the scents settle. It is a smell that both invites and warns, promising nourishment, yet reminding you that patience is required. You pause beside one jar and lean closer. The lid is tied with new reed cord, the fibers pale and smooth. A thin film of salt has formed along the rim, white against the clay's brown glaze. You touch it lightly with a fingertip and taste, sharp and clean, like the edge of a cold wave. This salt, carried from distant coasts, is one of the cellar's quiet luxuries. Villages far inland will trade paper, copper, or even tools to have it, knowing its purity will keep the jars safe through the winter. Somewhere to your left, a jar makes a faint, slow sound, a bubble slipping upward, finding its way between leaves and paste. You listen for it again, but it has already vanished into the steady hum of the place. The hum is not mechanical. It comes from countless tiny exchanges between leaf, spice, and brine, the quiet industry of food becoming more than it was. Historians still debate whether the pungency of kimchi was always so bold, or whether the arrival of chili peppers transformed the balance entirely. The earliest records speak of a vegetable pickle, pale and mild, often flavored with roots and herbs instead of heat. Some argue that the deeper, sharper scents we know now would have been almost alien to the earliest cellar keepers. Others believe that garlic and fermentation alone would have given a similar intensity, the kind that clings to the air, as it does now, making it almost visible. You crouch and lift the edge of a straw mat lying beside one of the jars. Its fibers smell faintly smoky, as though dried near a kitchen hearth. In the colder months, these mats will be wrapped around jars or laid over their lids to insulate against sudden drops in temperature. You run your hand along its weave, feeling where it has softened from years of use. At the far end of the cellar, an older woman is bent over a jar, her sleeves tied back with a strip of cloth. She works slowly, turning the cabbage leaves beneath the brine with a wooden paddle, checking for evenness. She glances up briefly and nods, her eyes half hidden in the shadow of her headscarf. Her motions are steady, almost meditative, as if the task itself were a form of keeping time. The scent grows stronger as you pass her sharper here, where the jar is open. You catch a glint of chili paste clinging to the leaves, its color muted in the dim light. Somewhere in the folds, thin strands of scallion float, their green turned deep and dark. You imagine the taste, salty, sour, and edged with heat, a flavor shaped by months in the cool belly of the earth. At the cellar's center, you stop and let the scent swirl together, the clean sting of salt, the rich undertone of aged vegetables, the faint woodiness of garlic skins. It is not a fragrance that would be bottled or sold, yet it belongs perfectly here, to this quiet place where food changes slowly, hidden from the sun. You take one more breath before moving on, knowing that the scent will cling to your sleeves long after you leave, a reminder of jars and patience, and of mornings that begin not with fire or feast, but with the quiet work of the cellar. Winter's protective layer lies over many of the jars like a patchwork quilt of the earth itself. Straw mats, thick and woven tight, are draped across the domed lids and tied in place with loops of reed cord. The straw is the color of dry sun and carries the faint scent of smoke from the hearth where it was dried. You rest your hand on one mat. It is slightly rough, the fibers flattened in places where countless hands have lifted and set it down again. The mats are more than mere covers. They are guardians against the abrupt moods of the season. In early winter, the air can drop sharply in a single night, and the jars, though half buried, feel the change. The mats trap a little of the cellar's stored warmth, slowing the chill's bite, so that fermentation continues its slow and steady work. Without them, the leaves inside might stiffen, the brine's surface turn sluggish, and the long patience of months be lost in a single frost. A woman moves down the row ahead of you, checking each cover. She tugs one tighter, reknots a cord, smooths a mat so it hugs the curve of the jar more closely. Her breath clouds in the cool air, though here in the cellar the cold is gentler than above ground. She hums softly, a tune with no clear beginning or end, the kind that might be passed from work to work without ever being written down. Historians still wonder when exactly the practice of covering jars with straw began. Some believe it is as old as earthen storage itself, a habit born of necessity in villages where winter winds cut without mercy. Others suggest it may have begun in regions where sudden weather shifts were common, carried later to places where the cold crept in more slowly. The records are silent, leaving only the mats themselves to tell the story. You lift the edge of one mat to peek beneath. The lid's surface is cool, beaded with tiny drops of condensation. The clay beneath feels firm, its seam unbroken, the cord still taut. You let the mat fall back into place, the straw whispering as it settles. Leaning close, you notice how each mat is slightly different. Some are woven in simple over and under patterns, others in a tighter braid that looks almost decorative. A few have small patches sewn in where the straw has thinned. These repairs, done with fresh fibers, give the mats a kind of layered history, last year's frost still visible beside the work of the present season. At the far end of the row, a bundle of spare mats leans against the wall, bound with a strip of hemp. Their edges are still frayed from cutting, the scent of field and sun clinging to them. In the months to come, they will be pulled into service, replacing those worn thin by the press of many winters. You stand still for a moment, looking down the line of jars dressed in their winter coats of straw. They look almost like sleeping animals, each curled into its place, waiting for the slow turning of the season. Above them, the cellar's earthen ceiling holds its silence, the weight of soil and snow pressing softly from above. The cabbage waits in baskets near the cellar mouth, pale green and tightly layered, the ribs thick like the spines of folded fans. You kneel beside the baskets and lift one head in both hands. The outer leaves are cool and slightly damp, their edges frilled from the last rinse. You draw a small knife down the core, not to cut it apart, but to open it so the leaves loosen with a soft sigh. The sound is modest, almost private, like the breath a book gives when its pages are parted for the first time. You spread the leaves gently, one fold at a time, and the inner color brightens from celadon to a tender yellow. A bowl of coarse sea salt sits within reach, the crystals irregular, some sharp as tiny flakes of shell. You pinch a measure and let it fall between the leaves, not on the surface, but where the ribs meet, where the salt can cling and begin its quiet labor. The motion repeats. Lift, open, salt, press, set aside. Your hands grow colder with each head, but the rhythm warms your wrists. The floor around you grows glazed with spilled drops. The brine comes later. For now, the salt alone will draw moisture from the leaves, turning firmness to pliancy. This preliminary salting is a steady practice, as well known as the jars themselves. The idea is simple and old. Salt persuades the cabbage to relax, to surrender some of its water, to become ready for what the cellar will ask of it. Across the baskets, the first salted heads begin to sweat, beads forming like dew along the ribs. An older woman sits cross-legged nearby, a wooden tub between her knees. She salts more quickly, the motion tucked into the memory of her fingers. Every so often, she tests the heft of a leaf, bending it just enough to feel whether it has softened. She does not measure with spoons or scales, but with what she calls the weight in her hands. Some accounts insist that this sense salt, judged by touch rather than by count, has guided kitchens for longer than any written recipe. Whether that instinct was once paired with exact rules now forgotten, historians still wonder. The results remain in the mouth, but the numbers are lost to time. You reach for a second bowl, this one filled with narrow lengths of salted radish, meant to be tucked between the cabbage layers later. Their scent is sharper, almost peppery without heat, a clean line in the mix of aromas. You set them aside for now and keep salting. The crystals catch the light like coarse snow. When one falls to the floor and shatters, it makes a tiny sound, crisp enough to notice in the cellar's quiet. A thought drifts through you as the work continues. Some say the best salting days fall under a stable sky, neither heavy with rain nor crackling with dry wind. A fringe belief perhaps, but repeated often enough to become part of the rhythm that the air's mood finds its way into the jars. One grandmother claimed she could taste a storm that never broke in the crunch of a spring leaf months later. You do not say this aloud, but your hands move a little slower when the lamp flickers, as if to respect the air. The salted cabbages are laid in a wide basin, the halves stacked like tidy stones. You pour a ladle of clean water, threaded with a little extra salt over them, bathing the leaves so the crystals melt and travel further in. The smell lifts, brighter now, almost sweet at the edges. You press the stack with a flat, clean stone, an old habit once used more firmly to weigh greens under brine. Now gentler, a memory of heavier times. A mainstream truth remains regardless of method. Sea salt, coarse and low in bitter minerals, has long been preferred for this work, prized enough that villagers would trade farm tools or paper to secure enough for winter. A child appears at the cellar door, his cheeks red from the morning air. He watches from the threshold, then ventures a hand toward a leaf that has slid free of the basin. You glance up and he freezes, not frightened, only measuring whether this is a forbidden theft. You tear the nearest leaf's tough tip away and pass him the tender heart, lightly salted but not yet stung by spice. He bites and nods solemnly, as if tasting a secret. In some households, children are sent to fetch the flat stones used for pressing, told to choose ones that listen well. Whether stones can hear is a playful claim, and yet the child taps each one before carrying it back, as if choosing a companion, not a weight. Time begins to show in the leaves. What was stiff is now flexible. You lift a half and shake it once. The ribs bend without snapping. The surface glistens. This is the right moment, not fully soft, not still hard, but the place between. Scholars writing about kitchen practice still argue whether this stage was always sought with such precision, or whether earlier pickles preferred a firmer bite. The oldest mentions in records favor broad strokes, soak, salt, keep leaving the finer point of texture to be guessed from long, quiet mouths. You move the basin aside and bring forward a shallow tray with spice paste waiting not yet for this step, but near enough to be a promise. The paste is a low red in the lamplight, damp and grainy, worked with garlic and something sweetened by rice gruel. You do not add it now. First, the cabbage must be rinsed so it does not carry too much sharpness into the jar. 2 buckets sit ready, one of cold, one of colder. You lift each softened half and slip it through the water, turning so the salt that did its work can leave what it softened behind. When you taste a drip from the tip of a leaf, it is briny but not stinging. The aftertaste is clean, like stone washed by a low stream. You set the rinsed halves to drain on a slatted tray, their leaves parted just enough to release what they do not need. A low breeze runs along the cellar floor, not wind, only the slow exchange of cool air, and helps the last droplets gather and fall. At your side, the older woman murmurs a counting song under her breath. It is not about numbers, it is about waiting with company. The song lifts at the same places that your work pauses. Lift, open, rinse, turn, rest. She tells you, without looking up, that long ago her mother salted cabbages by moonlight for luck, but only when the moon was thin, because a wide moon gave leaves too much boldness. Such sayings live at the edge of habit, fringe to some, thread to others, and yet they shape the hush of this cellar as surely as any rule. You gather the drained halves at last. The ribs gleam, the leaves hold their curve without tearing. Your hands smell of sea and leaf and quiet labor. The baskets that were full now sit almost empty, and the floor bears a constellation of wet marks that will dry to faint rings by midday. The salting is finished, and the cabbage is ready to meet the paste and the jar. You cover the basin with a clean cloth and press the edges down with the same flat stone. The cloth breathes, the stone agrees. For a while, the cabbages will rest, and think about what comes next. You sit back on your heels, letting your knees complain softly, and look across the cellar at the rows of patient jars. The work continues, but never in a hurry. The leaf must learn the salt before it can learn the spice, and you must learn the leaf before either can be trusted to winter. The smaller pots sit closer to the door, as if they like a little light. Their bellies are stout and their necks short, each sealed with a lid tied by a neat cross of cord. You lift one gently and hear the soft slosh within, lighter than the deep, slow tone of the tall cabbage jars. When you set it back, the clay gives a mild, contented thud against the floor, as though the pot recognizes its place. You untie the cord and ease the lid aside. A cool breath rises clean, sharp, and a little sweet, and beneath it the colors are quiet but sure. Pale cubes of radish, edges rounded by brine, threads of scallion, flecks of red paste that look darker in the dimness. You tilt the pot until the brine finds the lip, then watch it settle again, clear enough to show the soft corners of the cubes below. The scent is different from cabbage, brisk, quick to reach the nose, like a bell struck lightly rather than a drum. Beside you, the older woman's hands hover, ready to help if needed and content if not. She tells you the cube should be no larger than the first joint of a thumb, unless the radishes are old and stubborn, in which case thicker cuts keep them from turning watery. You pick up a piece with wooden chopsticks, feel its weight, and press your teeth through the tender edge. The bite resists, then yields. Brine and spice come forward, and the radish's own faint sweetness lingers. A mainstream truth sits easily here. Radish has long been a faithful partner in these cellars, a winter root that stores well and gives a clearer crunch than leaf. It is not recent fashion. Written accounts from earlier centuries mention pickled roots served beside warm bowls of grain, and earthen household records marks on jar lids. Notes kept on scraps of wood show that small pots were set aside for roots even when the larger jars were reserved for cabbage. The practice of keeping these shorter vessels near the entrance has a practical reason too. They are lighter to lift and reach more often, since radish, unlike leaf, is eaten young as well as aged. You lift another cube and listen. An old custom says a good radish will sing when cut, a tiny squeak against the knife that hints at freshness. Whether radishes can truly sing, or whether ears learn to hear what hands already know, is the sort of tidbit that lives comfortably between joke and rule. One aunt swore by cutting radish at dawn so the root wakes polite, not swollen with the day's heat. Another insisted that a quiet weather day kept the brine from turning cloudy. The cellar gathers such beliefs without arguing with them. You stir gently from the bottom with a wooden paddle. A few threads of scallion lift and fall, and bits of red paste drift back to cling in corners. The paste in this pot is simpler than the one for cabbage, more ginger than garlic, a touch of sweet from rice gruel to soften the edge, and a measured pinch of the same sea salt that keeps all these jars honest. The chilies, when they are used, lend warmth rather than boasting. In some houses, the root is kept pale, flavored with mustard leaf, ginger, and brined fish liquor instead. The choice travels along family lines more than along maps. Scholars still argue when the neat cube style became its own name, and not merely radish pickled. The word appears in some accounts later than the root itself, which, of course, is older than any record kept in ink. Some point to coastal markets and their fashion of tidy cutting for travel and trade. Others say the habit began with thrifty cooks, who favored even pieces for even fermenting. The earliest notes are stingy with detail, and memory fills the gaps with whatever its hands have learned. On the bench, a small knife lies with a handle polished by years. You pick it up and feel the balance short, confident, ready to square a root. Beside it sits a measuring spoon carved from gourd, a tool more for pride than necessity. Most measures here are handfuls, pinches, and the familiar heft of a jar. Even so, the woman points to the spoon and says it is for days when one's mind wanders. A wandering mind salts twice, she murmurs, pulling the lid from another pot to check the surface. The brine in the second pot is cloudier, not a fault but a sign of younger days. Radish gives itself more quickly than cabbage. Where cabbage needs months to speak clearly, radish can be ready in weeks, and sometimes a portion is eaten within days, while the rest is left to deepen. You press a cube against the pot's wall with the paddle, and watch the tiny trail of bubbles that rise and answer. Little voices, the cellar folk call them. If the surface grows too quiet too soon, they worry. If it shouts, they worry as well. Near the door, a basket holds thin radish greens saved from cutting. Some will join salted fish to make a quick relish. Some will dry on a line and later soften in a broth. Nothing in this place is hurried, and nothing is wasted if care can save it. You knot the basket's cord and set it higher, away from the draft. A small charm is tied to the shelf post, a strip of paper brushed with 3 neat characters, and a single radish seed pressed into the fiber before it dried. The woman says the charm is from a traveling scribe who traded his handwriting for supper. Whether such charms sweeten flavor or simply sweeten the mood of those who tend the jars is another question left to kitchens. Still, the charm remains where it hangs, unremarked by anyone but you. You taste again, this time from the older pot, and notice how the heat has softened into a round warmth, while the radish's inner sweetness has grown clearer. The difference between young and settled is like the difference between a stream and the pool it feeds. Both water, both clean, but the tongue feels the patience in the second. A steady fact stretches beneath all this tasting. The clay itself helps. These onggi breathe in their slow way, letting gases escape while keeping outside air at a respectful distance. That breath guides roots as surely as it guides leaves. You replace the lids and tie the cords once more. The little pots look dignified, like elders wearing plain coats. You lift one to settle it a finger's width farther from the door, not for any fixed reason, only because the light there seems a touch bright today. The habit of small adjustments is as old as the jars a bench moved, a mat turned, a pot slid by the breadth of a thumb. Whether these shifts matter to flavor or mostly to the keeper's peace of mind is a debate that no tongue can settle completely. Before leaving, you scrape a sidelong glance into the last pot and find a single wedge cut not as a cube but as a tiny crescent. Someone's hand wandered or intended a sign. In one household, a first crescent is left as an offering to the household spirit before the rest are squared. In another, a crescent tucked near the bottom is meant to mark the pot for a celebration weeks away. Quirk or custom, it stays beneath the brine, private and unbothered. You set the final lid back with a gentle turn until clay meets clay, and the sound lands soft as cloth. The row of small pots settles into stillness again. Their work is mostly done without you. Root listening to salt, brine listening to clay, time listening to no one, and moving anyway. You wipe your hands on a clean cloth and breathe the bright, crisp scent one last time. Then you step inward, back toward the deeper rows, leaving the small voices near the door to keep their own slow conversation. 2 women work in the far aisle, their heads bent toward the jars as if confiding in them. You watch from a short distance before moving closer, careful not to break the rhythm of their motions. One holds a flat wooden paddle, the other a short-handled brush made from straw. Together, they adjust lids, check cords, and sweep stray bits of dried paste from the jar shoulders. The air around them is full of low sounds, clay lids being lifted just enough to peak. The faint rub of straw bristles against glaze, the muted tap of a pebble used to test a seal. You stop beside them, and the older of the 2 straightens slowly, her knees sighing audibly. She greets you with a nod, not a word, before moving to the next jar. Her hands move with a kind of quiet authority, each gesture economical but never rushed. She slips a narrow reed between lid and rim, easing it upward with the smallest twist, just enough to check for trouble. Mold on the surface, an unpleasant smell, or a shift in the brine's color. Satisfied, she lowers the lid again, pressing it down until clay meets clay with a deep, muffled note. The younger woman works 2 steps behind, tightening cords and brushing away any stray salt or paste. Her brush leaves faint trails in the thin layer of dust on the lids, revealing the richer brown beneath. She glances up once, meeting your eyes briefly, as if to say that the work may be simple but it is never idle. This kind of attention, she says quietly, is what keeps the jars from turning sullen in the dark. A mainstream truth underlies their care. Fermentation is patient, but not careless. A jar may sit for months without interference, yet a single neglected seal can invite ruin. That is why cellars like this one have keepers who walk the rows regularly. listening with their hands as much as with their ears. The smallest sign, a cord gone slack, a lid that feels warm to the touch, can be the first whisper of change. You notice that the older woman occasionally leans in, almost as if smelling for a story rather than a fault. Some say they can tell whether a jar is in good health just by the tone of its scent, the way it mingles with the cellar's air. Whether this is skill, luck, or wishful thinking is an old question. Historians still debate whether traditional fermentation required such constant human presence, or whether, in busier times, jars were sealed and left to their own devices for entire seasons. The records are inconsistent. The arguments persist. The younger woman moves to a jar with a lid slightly off-center. She loosens the cord, shifts the lid until it sits square, then reties it with a firm, even pull. The cord's fibers creak faintly as they tighten. She runs her thumb along the knot to flatten it, making sure it will not snag. The knot itself is an old pattern, a double loop with a final tuck, chosen because it can be undone with one pull, even if the cord swells in damp weather. You bend to watch the older woman check another jar. She uses the small pebble again, tapping just above the lid's edge and listening. The sound changes if the seal is compromised. It grows hollow, she says, or uneven, like a drum with a loose skin. She gives you the pebble to try. You tap, hear a note that is duller than you expected, and she smiles faintly. "Good jar," she says, then returns the pebble to its place by the jar's base. In the corner, a shallow tray holds a mix of tools: spare cords, strips of cloth, small pots of clay for resealing, and an assortment of pebbles smooth enough for testing. Each tool bears signs of years of use. The cords are frayed at the ends. The claws are stained with salt and brine. The clay is wrapped in damp leaves to keep it pliable, its surface marked with finger grooves from countless sealings. A fringe belief drifts into the conversation, that jars respond to kindness. The younger woman says her grandmother whispered greetings to each jar when checking them. The older one scoffs lightly but admits she still avoids speaking harshly in the cellar. Whether jars hear or not, the mood of the keepers shapes the mood of the place. And so the work continues in low voices, never hurried, never loud. As they move on, you follow, watching their sequence: lift, glance, press, tie, brush. The pattern is steady, and you can imagine it repeating exactly the same way a year from now and a year after that, changing only when the keepers change. At the end of the row, they pause, stepping back to look at the line of jars as a whole, checking for anything out of place. Satisfied, they nod to each other, and the older woman gestures for you to go ahead. You walk past them into the next aisle, carrying with you the quiet discipline of their work, the sense that tending jars is not merely a task, but a conversation kept over months, in which the best words are the ones spoken without sound. In a shaded alcove near the back wall, you find a low shelf stacked with smooth river stones, each about the size of your palm. Their surfaces are worn satin slick, as if the water that shaped them still lingers in memory. You crouch and run your fingers over one, cool, weighty, with a subtle flatness on one side from years of pressing cabbage under brine. A woman kneeling nearby glances up and nods toward the pile. "Old stones," she says simply. "They are not for decoration. Each was once chosen for its heft and balance, carried from a riverbank or streambed that might be a day's walk away. The flatness helps them rest evenly over the leaves, keeping them submerged. Too light, and the greens float. Too heavy, and they bruise. Finding the right stone is a matter of patience and luck, and once chosen, it often stays in the same household for generations. You pick one up and test its weight in your palm. It feels almost alive, the coolness seeping into your skin. The edges are not sharp, but the shape is irregular enough to sit comfortably in the curve of a jar's shoulder. A mainstream fact holds here. Before the arrival of tight-fitting lids and corded seals, such stones were essential. Even with the invention of heavier jar lids, many keepers still lay a stone directly on the top layer of leaves as a gesture of habit, if not necessity. Some stones carry marks, faint scratches, or small chisel lines from times when they were shaped deliberately. Others remain just as they were found, their perfection decided by the current that carried them. You turn one over to find a dark streak running through it, a vein of mineral that catches the lamplight. It reminds you of a story told in the village, that a stone with a single dark line brings a steady flavor, while one with many lines will make the brine restless. Historians still argue whether such beliefs shaped actual practice, or whether they were simply a way of keeping certain stones in certain families. You lift a particularly heavy stone from the bottom of the stack. Its underside is faintly stained with red, a reminder of chilies that clung to it seasons ago. The scent is gone, but the color remains, worked deep into the pores of the rock. The keeper nearby watches you examine it and remarks that some stones learn the flavor of a household, holding the memory even after years of rest. Whether that is taste or imagination is impossible to prove, but the idea is quietly satisfying. Beside the stones lies a shallow wooden basin used for washing them. The water inside is cloudy from the last cleaning, flecked with tiny bits of leaf and paste. A small ladle rests across the rim. Washing stones is not done in haste. Each is turned and rubbed carefully to free it from any trace of the last batch. This ensures that no old brine carries forward into the next, except what clings in the keeper's mind. One particularly small stone catches your attention. It is round and pale, no larger than a hen's egg. The woman tells you it is not for weighing cabbage at all, but for listening, tapped lightly against the jar's side to hear how the brine sits. You remember the pebble from earlier and realize that such tools are not rare, only cherished. She demonstrates, tapping the side of a jar. The sound it makes is low and full, a sign the jar is well packed and content. You imagine the many hands that have lifted these stones, wet from the river, gritty from drying on the bank, warm from a kitchen, slick from brine. Each use adds a thin layer of history, not in appearance alone, but in the way the stone is recognized by touch. No two feel exactly the same, and experienced keepers often choose by instinct, without needing to look. In one corner of the shelf, a small cloth pouch hangs from a peg. Inside are river pebbles the size of fingertips, gathered for reasons no one explains directly. A fringe tidbit drifts into the conversation that placing 3 of these tiny stones in a jar's brine will keep the spirit of freshness from wandering. The woman laughs as she tells it, but she does not dismiss it entirely. Whether it began as a joke or a charm, the habit persists in some households. You set the heavy stone back on the shelf, arranging it with the flat side down, as the others are kept. The stack looks like a quiet, patient council, each stone waiting for the next season's work. The air here feels a little cooler, perhaps from the memory of rivers caught in the stone's smooth curves. Before you leave, you pick up the small egg-sized stone and roll it once in your palm. It holds no warmth yet, but it carries the weight of many winters. You return it to its pouch and step back toward the center of the cellar, where jars and stones share the same unhurried sense of time. Near the back wall, a stack of reed baskets holds long, wrinkled strings of dried red chilies. Their color is deep and dark, closer to the shade of old lacquer than to the bright scarlet they once were. You lift one string and feel the brittle skin give a faint crackle under your fingers. Even in their dried state, the chilies carry a low, steady heat, not sharp enough to sting the air, but enough to remind you that they are here for more than color. A younger man sits cross-legged beside the baskets, sorting through the strings with a small knife. He trims away any stems that have grown soft or spotted with pale dust. Each clean chili is dropped into a shallow wooden tray, where it will wait to be ground into the paste for cabbage and radish alike. He works without hurry, glancing occasionally toward the jars as if they too might be watching his progress. The journey of these chilies is not short. A mainstream fact ties them to the warmer coasts far to the south, where the growing season is longer and the frost arrives late. From there, traders carry them inland, sometimes dried whole, sometimes ground into coarse powder along routes that also bring salt, fish, and cloth. The sight of baskets like these in a mountain cellar is a quiet reminder of the threads that connect distant landscapes to this small, earth-lined room. You pick up a single dried chili and hold it to the light of the oil lamp. Its surface is a landscape in miniature, ridged, creased, and faintly glossy, where the skin still holds its oils. The seeds inside rattle when you shake it gently. The man beside you says some keepers scatter a few whole chilies into a jar, not for flavor, but for what he calls watchfulness. Whether this means warding off spoilage or simply marking the jar as one that deserves special attention, is unclear, even to him. Historians still debate exactly when chilies first arrived here. Some argue for the late 16th century, brought by traders returning from far-off lands. Others suggest earlier introductions through smaller, less documented exchanges. The written record is tangled, with references that could mean chili, pepper, or entirely different plants depending on the scribe's habit. What is certain is that the bold red paste, now so closely tied to kimchi, did not exist in the earliest centuries of the dish's history. Before chilies, the spice and color came from other roots, herbs, and salted seafoods. The man crushes a chili between his palms, and the seeds scatter into the tray like tiny grains of bone. The scent rises immediately warm, almost sweet before the heat arrives. You lean closer, catching the way the sharpness threads itself into the cellar's slower, deeper aromas. He tips the crushed skin into a small stone mortar, adding a handful of coarse sea salt. The pestle moves in slow circles, breaking the skins further until the red deepens and the air grows brighter with scent. A fringe story comes to mind, that one should never grind chilies on a storm day, for the heat will grow unruly and the flavor unbalanced. Some say it is because the air's moisture dulls the work. Others simply nod and refuse to risk it. Whether true or not, the man tells you he always prefers clear, calm mornings for the task. Beside the mortar lies a folded scrap of paper, brushed with characters noting the source of this year's chilies, a particular village near the coast known for its thin-skinned, sweet hot variety. The note is tucked into the basket, as though the chilies themselves might remember their home better if reminded. You watch as he transfers the bright powder into a larger wooden bowl, where it will be mixed with garlic, ginger, fish sauce, and rice gruel to form the paste. For now, though, the powder sits on its own, vivid against the wood's dark grain. You can imagine it seeping into cabbage leaves, staining them with a deep red that has become the mark of winter stores in this place. Before leaving the alcove, you set the chili you were holding back into its place among the strings. It hangs lightly, almost weightless, but it carries with it the miles it has traveled from field to market, from market to basket, from basket to cellar, waiting now to be folded into the slow, patient life of the jars. On a narrow shelf near the jars, bundles of roots and rhizomes lie bound in twists of straw. Some are familiar pale, knobbly ginger with thin skins that flake under a fingernail. Garlic bulbs whose papery layers catch the lamplight. Lengths of dried scallion, their green turned the color of hay. Others are less easy to name. You pick up a thin, wiry root coiled like a sleeping snake, its surface the shade of old bone. The scent, when you snap a small piece, is earthy with a trace of sweetness, like rain-damp soil in early spring. A woman sorting the bundles looks up and smiles faintly. She says the known roots will go into the spice paste for their flavor and warmth, while the unfamiliar ones, mystery roots, she calls them, are for a recipe her grandmother taught her, used only in certain seasons. She shrugs when you ask what they are. No one agrees, she says. Some say wild ginseng, some say angelica, some say nothing at all. She tucks the root back into its bundle with care, as if mystery were reason enough to keep it. A mainstream truth is easy to spot here. Ginger and garlic have long been trusted companions in the making of kimchi, not just for taste, but for the way they guard against spoilage. Records from court kitchens and rural households alike mention them, though the proportions vary wildly. A thumb of ginger in one recipe, a fistful in another. The pairing is so constant now that it is hard to imagine a time without it. But tucked between the ginger and garlic are smaller pouches made of cloth, tied with knots so neat they look decorative. The woman opens one to show you thin, fibrous shavings, the color of honey. Their smell is faintly floral, almost medicinal. Some use this for stomach warmth, she says, some for the jar's mood. The phrase makes you pause. She explains that her grandmother believed certain roots could calm a ferment that threatened to grow too sharp. Whether this is science or story is unclear, but she keeps the habit out of respect. Historians still puzzle over such additions. Were they always part of regional kimchi making, or did they begin as remedies slipped into food? The written accounts rarely separate medicine from cooking. A root might be prescribed for an ailment and also for a winter feast. This overlap leaves scholars arguing whether the line between healing and seasoning ever truly existed in the first place. The woman shows you a flat wooden tray where some of the roots are drying. The ginger pieces curl slightly as they lose moisture, their golden flesh darkening at the edges. Garlic cloves, sliced thin, lie beside them like pale coins. The air above the tray is sharper, the mingling scents catching in your nose. She turns the pieces gently, making sure they dry evenly. Even when dried, she says, they remember the jar. A fringe belief floats into the conversation, that certain roots should be harvested at night, when their spirit is at rest. Some families send younger members into the fields with small lanterns, returning with baskets of pale shapes glinting in the lamplight. The woman laughs softly, admitting she has done this herself, though she cannot say whether it makes a difference in flavor. Still, she remembers the quiet of those nights, the feel of damp soil under her hands, and perhaps that is reason enough. In the corner, a small clay jar holds slices of ginger submerged in brine. The liquid is cloudy, and the surface glistens faintly. These will not go into the kimchi paste, but into the cooking hut for a broth said to warm the body against winter's damp. She dips a chopstick into the jar and lifts a slice for you to smell. The brine carries both sharpness and sweetness, a balance that mirrors the way the cellar itself smells when the jars are in good health. You set the slice back and glance again at the bundles on the shelf. Each is tied tightly, the knots all facing the same way. The woman says this is not for order but for ease, so she can untie them in the same way each time, even in low light. It's a small habit, but one that speaks to the slow, deliberate thinking that guides all work here. Before leaving, you take one last look at the mystery root. Its coiled form is oddly graceful, its identity still unsettled. It seems at home among the ginger and garlic, even if no one can name it with certainty. You set it back gently, thinking that perhaps some things are better left to remain half-known, their presence valued more for the quiet question they keep alive than for any definite answer. The air in the deepest part of the cellar feels thicker, as if it has learned to hold its breath. You pause there and let your ears adjust to the quiet. At first, you think you hear nothing at all, but then the smallest sounds begin to separate from the stillness, a faint fizz like a sigh through teeth, a soft tap that might be a bubble escaping along a cabbage rib, the nearly imperceptible shift of a cord tightening as it dries. You crouch beside one of the larger jars and place your palm against its side. The clay is cool, but there's a subtle vibration beneath it, not like machinery, but like the hum of something that is alive in a way plants and people are alive, slow, invisible work happening without hurry. You press your ear closer to the lid. Beneath the brine's still surface, leaves loosen their grip. Flavors thread themselves together, and gases slip upward in tiny chains. A mainstream fact fits neatly here. Fermentation is a constant, active process, even when it looks still. The lactic acid that guards the kimchi against spoilage is being made moment by moment, its balance shifting subtly as days pass. To those who tend jars daily, the absence of sound can be as telling as its presence. A jar too quiet for too long may be sleeping too deeply. A jar that chatters might be rushing toward sharpness too soon. Some say they can tell the mood of a ferment by the way it speaks at night. In old kitchens, keepers would leave their bedding close to the cellar stairs, claiming they could hear the jars talking in the dark, not with words, but with the gentle breaking of bubbles, the soft kiss of brine against clay. Whether this is poetic fancy or practiced listening is still debated by scholars, who note that no record proves or disproves the habit. You lean back and take in the smell around you. It is layered, the deep saltiness of brine, the mellowed bite of garlic, the faint sharpness of cabbage, and an earthy undertone from the packed clay walls. The air feels warmer here, though the temperature is the same. It is the closeness, the way the scents seem to settle on your skin. At the far end, a single jar has been left uncovered for a moment. Its surface shifts with the rise of tiny bubbles, each one breaking silently before it reaches the center. A narrow wooden spoon rests across the rim, the brine clinging to it in thin, clear lines. A younger keeper steps forward and dips the spoon gently, lifting a leaf to check its color. The brine drips back into the jar with a sound like the first drop of rain hitting still water. A fringe belief finds its way into your thoughts, that jars which bubble too much should be soothed by a song. Some families hum low, steady tunes while turning the leaves, believing it slows the ferment's restlessness. The keeper here doesn't sing, but her movements are unhurried enough to feel like music. She lays the leaf back under the surface, smooths it once with the spoon, and replaces the lid without a word. The walls of the cellar seem to listen as well. Their surface is uneven, marked by the lines of the tools that packed the clay years ago. In some places, the walls bow inward slightly, making the space feel more enclosed. You wonder if the jars notice this, if they feel the closeness as a comfort, the way people do when they lean against a familiar wall. You step carefully between the rows, the soles of your sandals brushing the fine grit that gathers in the center of the floor. Every so often, you pause to listen again. The sounds are never exactly the same twice. One jar pops faintly, another exhales a soft hiss, another stays entirely still for minutes before offering a single bubble, as if to prove it's still awake. By the time you reach the end of the row, your ears are tuned to the cellar's quiet speech. You think about how easy it is to miss this language above ground, where the wind, the water, and the voices of people all compete for space. Down here, nothing interrupts but time, and time is in no rush to move. You place your hand once more on the nearest jar, feeling that subtle vibration. It is not a greeting, not an answer, but something like a reminder. The work is happening whether you stand here or not, whether you listen or not. The jars have no need for your attention, yet they hold it all the same. You move toward the jars closest to the cellar's center, where the air feels a little cooler and the earth above is thickest. Here, the rows seem tighter, the shoulders of the jars nearly touching. The light from the small oil lamp on the wall glances off their curved surfaces, leaving the spaces between them in shadow. You pause, letting your eyes rest, and think about why these central spots are so prized. A mainstream fact explains it simply. Jars kept in the deepest part of the cellar are the most stable through winter. The temperature here changes least, even when the surface world swings between thaw and frost. This constancy is vital. Sudden cold can slow fermentation too much, while unexpected warmth can push it too fast. The jars in this spot have the quiet luxury of time moving at a steady pace. You step closer and lay your palm against one of the central jars. It is cool, but not cold, the kind of evenness you imagine a winter animal feels in its den. Your fingertips find the faint texture of the glaze, the small ridges from the potter's wheel that survived the firing. You leave your hand there for a moment, as if you might sense the calm that comes from such steadiness. Between two jars, a narrow strip of straw matting runs along the floor. The edges are frayed, and some of the fibers are stained, a soft reddish brown. The mat isn't here for insulation, but as a walkway, it keeps the floor from wearing unevenly under constant steps. A cellar keeper appears from the far side of the row, her basket resting lightly against her hip. She nods, then kneels by a jar and checks the cord binding its lid. The jars here are dressed with more than just lids and cords. Small paper tags hang from the cords, each marked with a date and a short note in brushstroke. First snow, day after harvest, moonless night. These are not simply for record keeping. They are memory markers, reminders of the conditions when the jar was sealed. Some tags even carry sketches: a small cloud, a single wave, a branch with 3 leaves. Whether these drawings influence the jar's fate or merely please the keeper's eye is uncertain, and scholars still argue over whether such notes began as serious records or as quiet expressions of care. The keeper beside you lifts one jar's lid just enough to peek inside. She does not stir or taste, only looks. You glimpse the top layer of cabbage leaves, their folds tucked neatly, the brine clear and still. She replaces the lid with the same care she took in lifting it, pressing the cord so it lies flat again. The motion is so smooth it seems practiced beyond thought. A fringe belief surfaces in your memory that the center jars can lend their steadiness to others. Some households will move a jar showing signs of trouble, too much bubbling, a shift in scent into the middle for a few days, as though the calm air here might persuade it back into balance. Whether this works or is simply a way of keeping a watchful eye on a restless ferment is unclear, but the practice persists. You notice how the jars here seem almost solemn, their lids perfectly centered, their cords neatly tied without fraying. A small clay figure sits between two of them, a simple human shape with no features, just the impression of a face. Its surface is smudged with years of handling. The keeper says it was left by her grandmother, who believed it sat guard over the most important jars. Whether for protection or tradition, it remains in its place, undisturbed. The air in this part of the cellar has a different quality. It smells less of the sharp garlic and chili notes, more of earth and salt, as if the flavors here are quieter, more settled. You breathe it in and imagine the months passing without hurry, each day adding a shade of depth to the taste that will come. Before you leave the center, you run your hand once more over the jar nearest you. The cord is firm, the lid set with precision, the air around it still and steady. You step away with the sense that these jars, more than any others, will emerge from winter exactly as they should, unchanged, except for the changes that time alone can make. At first, you think the jars are unadorned, all practical belly and shoulder, made to hold patience rather than pride. Then, when the lamp leans its light at the right angle, you see them, pale impressions just below the rim, small as a thumbnail, pressed into the clay when it was still wet. You brush the pad of your finger across one. It is not quite a picture and not quite a letter, more like a quiet sign the potter left behind to say, "I was here." You examine another. This one is a simple circle crossed by a short bar. A third mark looks like a sprouting seed. Some are crisp, some softened by glaze and years of handling, but each holds its own voice. The marks sit where the hand naturally lands to lift the jar, as if they were placed for the keeper as much as for the maker. You trace them the way one traces the grain in wood, following curves and tiny breaks. A mainstream truth rests easily in this. Jar makers have long left kiln marks or workshop signs on their work. The impression might be stamped with a carved plug of wood, or pinched by a nail turned sideways, or pressed with the squared end of a reed. The mark tells which family or kiln shaped the clay, sometimes which valley the earth was dug from, sometimes even which firing in the season gave the jar its skin. Not all marks speak so clearly, but most say enough for neighboring hands to understand. You tilt a jar to catch the light along its shoulder. Beneath the thin brown glaze, the body shows tiny freckles, sand, and crushed old pottery worked into the clay. The jar breathes because of this mixture, the walls filling with 1,000 small paths that let gases leave, while air outside keeps a respectful distance. People say these jars exhale without opening their mouths. Your fingers learn the texture, not rough, not smooth, but like river stone rubbed with fine salt. A keeper joins you and points to a mark shaped like a half moon. "Hillside kiln," she says, tapping it with a fingernail. She explains that potters in her mother's village fired jars in long, low kilns built into the slope of a hill. The heat climbed from chamber to chamber, and the fire wrote its own record on the clay, a blush where flame licked, a sheen where ash kissed and melted. Whether this half moon always meant a hillside kiln or began as the sign of one particular family is argued even among locals. Scholars, too, still disagree. Some read the shapes as firm signatures. Others warn that meanings wander over generations like stories told at dusk. You find a different sign, 4 tiny dots pressed in a square. It sits near a patch of glaze that pooled into a darker puddle. The keeper smiles. 4 dots for good balance, she says, as if it were obvious. She tells you her grandmother favored jars with this dot square for fermenting soybean paste, insisting the jars held their temper better through summer heat. No rule in any written account promises such behavior. Still, the belief has survived 3 kitchen lifetimes and shows no sign of tiring. A fringed tidbit surfaces as she talks. Some potters, before the first firing of the season, hide a small clay figure, a kiln sprite, in the firebox. Seated with knees drawn up and hands together, the sprite is meant to keep the flame steady and the pots from cracking. After the firing, the figure is buried near the kiln door. Whether the sprite helps or the careful stacking of jars and the slow feeding of wood does all the work is not something anyone tries to test. The figure sits its silent watch either way. You step closer to a jar whose shoulder bears 2 marks. Side by side, one neat and deep, one faint and crooked. The keeper shrugs. "Master and apprentice," she says. Or master first, apprentice after. Or older brother, younger brother. No one agrees. Historians still argue whether the second impression means the jar changed hands mid-making, or whether it was simply the apprentice allowed a small pride near the end of his training. The jar itself offers no answer. It only keeps its mark and its contents. Another shoulder shows no stamp at all, only the potter's fingerprints caught in the turn 3 soft ovals climbing in a curve. You place your fingers beside them and feel how closely they fit your own. In some kilns, people say the apprentice would leave one hidden thumbprint inside the rim of a jar each season for luck, thinking the jar would remember the hand that first shaped it. The print would vanish under glaze and years, but the story would stay, told again whenever someone felt a smooth place that might once have been a ridge. You lift the lamp a little higher and find marks blurred into near invisibility under a wash of glossy brown. The glaze here is thicker, like honey set firm. The keeper explains that ash from the firing sometimes drifted and melted on the shoulders, smoothing the stamp. Some claim these ash-kissed jars drink in less brine on the first pour and lose less on dry days. Whether this is measurable or only a comfort told to the hands that choose them, scholars hesitate to say. The tests are hard to make without offending kitchens that do not wish their jars treated as scales. The base rings tell their own quiet tales. On one jar, shallow scratches cross the foot like woven straw, the pattern of the mat it dried upon before firing. On another, the foot is clean and sharp, as if it dried on a smooth board. Keepers sometimes read these signs the way fishermen read water. Not prophecy, but hints. A straw mark might whisper of quicker drying, a clean foot of slower, cooler days. No record binds these hints to any certain outcome. Yet the eye keeps reading. The hand keeps choosing. You run your palm slowly around a shoulder where the stamp resembles a tiny gourd. The keeper says jars with the gourd mark come from a valley whose clay is a little redder and a little stronger under heat. She adds, not quite teasing, that gourd-marked jars hold their temper when the cellar grows noisy with summer pickles. Whether clay can be patient is a question for poets, yet the jars with gourd marks are taken first when a new batch begins. Habit becomes law without needing to be written. A final mark draws you in, a narrow fish shape, barely there. The keeper leans close. Old, she whispers, though she cannot name the year. Some say fish stood for good keeping in wet seasons. Others say it named a road the kiln stood beside, a road that followed a stream. Records are thin. The fish remains, a sliver of certainty carrying a lake of not knowing. Historians still argue whether such shapes were signs for traders, blessings for households, or private jokes among potters who knew only that their marks would outlive their names. You lower the lamp and let the marks fade back into brown. The jars become plain again, all shoulder and patience. Yet you cannot unsee what you have seen. Every stamp is a small door into the jar's past. The hillside where clay was dug, the kiln where flame walked from end to end, the hand that turned and lifted and pressed a sign into wet earth. You rest your hand once more on the nearest shoulder, feeling the shallow dip of a circle under your palm, and think how many winters have passed since that press, how many quiet meals it has helped carry. When you step away, the marks go with you in memory. Moon, seed, dots, gourd, fish. The cellar seems fuller now, not with more jars, but with more voices. Each vessel keeps watch over its own slow sea, and each shoulder bears a sign that says only, keep, keep, keep. You rest your palm against the cellar's wall and feel how the earth answers with a steady coolness. The surface is not smooth. It bears shallow ridges from the wooden paddles that once pressed it tight, and faint thumb-shaped hollows where hands coaxed clay into obedience. When you draw your fingers down, a dusty film clings, the scent rising like wet pottery after rain. The wall has no desire to impress it, only wants to hold its shape and keep the jars comfortable. That is purpose enough. You lean closer. The color changes every few handspans. Here a brown soft as tea. There a darker seam where another layer was added in a different season. Small bits of sand sparkle when the lamp swings, and the occasional straw fiber lies half buried where the clay was tempered for strength. A mainstream truth sits plainly in your palm. Earth-packed walls, thick and tamped hard, steady as cellar's temperature and dampness, sheltering the jars from sudden moods of weather. The wall is not merely boundary. It is a quiet instrument, keeping the air slow, the seasons softened, and the brine unshocked by the world above. Near the floor, the clay bows inward. Not much, just enough to make a comfortable hollow at shin height for those who shuffle along in lamplight. You fit your heel to the curve and stand easier. Someone thought of this long ago, then taught it without words. When your knuckles wrap the surface, the sound is dull and content, with none of the brittleness that warns of dryness. A keeper passing by nods at the tone, as if you have greeted the wall properly. You trace a seam, where patched clay meets old clay, the join smoothed with a wet cloth, long since dried to softness. The patch is the shape of a river island, tidy at its edges, honest about being newer. Seasonal repairs are simply part of the room's breathing. A thin crack will appear after a hard frost. A mouse will try its luck behind a jar, or a corner will flake where baskets lean too long. The fix is always the same. Soak the wall, press in fresh clay mixed with straw, smooth the skin, and leave it to remember its task. You can see years of such mending a quiet family of shapes, each one a story no one bothers to tell because the ending is the same. It held. Along one length, the surface wears a soft sheen. The keeper explains that, in damp years, a thin wash of rice gruel is brushed over the clay to settle dust and help the wall keep its crumbs to itself. Whether this wash truly alters humidity or simply makes sweeping kinder to lungs, scholars still argue. The habit persists because it costs little and offends no one. The wall does appear calmer afterward, as if polished by patience. You admire the sheen anyway, unwilling to quarrel with a practice that leaves such a gentle line of light. You crouch and study the base where wall meets floor. A shallow channel, no wider than 2 fingers, runs along the perimeter. When the air turns wet, a fine sweat gathers at the wall and gifts a few drops to this runnel, which guides them toward a small pit near the steps. A flat stone covers the pit's mouth like a modest lid. The device is simple and old. Many cellars use some version of it. The jars never stand in puddles, and any errant moisture learns the path out. It is the kind of engineering that wears no pride, yet keeps dinners from turning sour. A fringed tidbit rests on a peg nearby, a bundle of dried mugwort tied with red thread. The keeper says a light fumigation, a slow smolder passed along the wall before winter's sealing, tells the damp to behave. The scent is grassy, bitter, and clean. Whether smoke chastens humidity or merely heartens the people doing the work, no ledger records. Still, on the first cold morning after harvest, a thin ribbon of smoke traces these curves, and no one calls it foolish. The wall, untroubled, keeps being a wall. You press your ear to the clay. The sound within is more feeling than noise, a broad hush, like a hand over a drum. If you are patient, you can hear the cellar in it, a jar sighing, a drop traveling, the small tick of reed cord as it dries and pulls. Keepers say the wall carries such rumors well. Historians still wonder how these rooms were first taught to listen, whether the bow and thickness rose from one clever village, or many slow experiments spread across valleys. Written records are thin. Footprints and fingertips tell more. The debate is friendly and endless. Lineage traced through mud. Your lamp picks out faint scratches waist high, running in short rows. Not words, not drawings, more like the marks a basket rim leaves when rested, or a paddle's edge while waiting. Over time, utility becomes pattern. You find also a deliberate touch. 3 small dents like the points of a triangle, pressed while the clay was wet, and then forgotten. The keeper shrugs. A counting mark? A child's joke? There is no answer left to retrieve. The wall keeps its secrets as kindly as it keeps the cold. You test the thickness with your knuckles again, moving along until the note changes near a corner. The tone grows slightly hollow there. The keeper notices and taps too, then fetches a shallow bowl, a scoop of damp clay, and a paddle. The repair is careful and slow. Wet, rub, press, smooth, silence. You watch the paddle's wide blade kiss the surface until it shines. If a mouse thinks it's found a door, she says, we remind it there is none. The wall, freshly persuaded, returns to its proper voice. A mainstream detail hides in plain sight. Straw in the clay. Finely chopped, it binds the earth as it dries, holds tiny passages that help the wall share its breath with the room. The same habit shows in jars. Grit and broken shard mixed in to build strength and lay 1,000 little paths. Many things here breathe without lungs. They only need pores and patience. You rub a small fiber loose and feel how tough it remains even after seasons in the dark. The field keeps working after the harvest in ways that no song bothers to mention. You step back to take the wall in as a whole. It curves slightly, learning the roundness of the slope outside rather than defying it. Some cellars are square, some oval, some follow the lie of a hill, like a burrow. Scholars still debate whether the earliest cellars were dug shallow with wooden bracing, or formed entirely of rammed earth from the start. The arguments use tool marks and old soil to make their cases, but the cellars themselves decline to testify. They simply continue to keep cabbage safe. On a small ledge, you see finger-length tablets of clay set to dry spare buttons for quick repairs. Each bears a thumbprint, pressed deep so the patch can be gripped with wet hands. A child must have made one. Its print is small and fierce. In some houses, first patches of the season belong to the youngest hands, a token of joining the work. The wall wears these small pledges quietly, the way a coat wears neat, mends at the elbows. Toward the door, the clay grows paler where the light reaches more often. A few strands of dried grass are tucked there like bookmarks. The keeper says they are merely reminders of where last spring's patching began. Another voice in the cellar argues that they encourage the wall to keep its edge. The debate is playful and harmless. You leave the grass where it lies. The wall seems content with both explanations. You press your palm flat one last time. The cool has warmed slightly under your skin, and the dust on your fingers now smells faintly of salt from the air. The wall has accepted a little of you, and you have borrowed a little of it, not enough to change either of you, only enough to share a moment of steadiness. You think of the seasons the wall has witnessed, jars lifted and lowered, songs hummed in the half-dark, storms passing unheard above. The clay has no pride in any of it, which might be the wisest stance of all. When you step away, the wall is exactly as it was, tamped, patched, unremarkable, essential. It will not be thanked at supper when a bowl of stew arrives bright with kimchi, but it will have earned the thanks anyway. You brush your hands, and fine dust falls like small snow to the straw at your feet. The jars wait, the air rests, and the wall, kindly stubborn, keeps on holding winter at a polite distance. You take a seat on the low bench near the center aisle, the wood worn smooth by years of resting hips and patient pauses. From here, the jars seem closer together, as if leaning in to listen. Two keepers settle beside you with baskets at their feet, their voices pitched to the cellar low, steady, more breath than sound. They do not speak to tell news. They speak the way hands move, to remind the body what it already knows. The first begins with a story, not quite a lesson and not quite a memory. She says that when she was small, she counted the knots on the jar cords to guess how many bowls the family would have in the spring. It was a foolish method, she admits, but it passed the cold afternoons. The second laughs, answering with her own small confession. She once hid a pepper seed under a jar's foot for luck, then forgot which jar it was, and spent a season tasting every batch as if luck had a flavor. The cellar receives these stories without judgment. The air folds them away like cloth. A mainstream truth sits quietly beneath their talk. When the frost draws near, many hands work together to salt, rinse, paste, and seal. Neighbors borrow each other's mats, trade a morning's labor for a ladle of brine, and pass paddles down a line without looking. This shared making is not ceremony. It is survival shaped into habit, a season when houses breathe the same spice and the same patience. In such weeks, cellars become classrooms without walls. A child learns where to place the stone. An aunt reminds which leaf belongs on top. A cousin corrects a knot with a single tug. The women trade instructions that sound like proverbs. Salt the ribs, the leaves will follow. Tie the cross firm enough to sing, soft enough to sleep. If the brine looks tired, give it a path. Each saying holds a piece of work inside it, like a spoon tucked into a sleeve. You can imagine them traveling from kitchen to kitchen long before any brush set them down in ink. Whether these sayings began in wealthy halls with many jars or in small yards with only one, is the kind of question scholars still circle without landing. The words themselves carry no map. They talk too of flavor as if it were a person with moods. This jar wakes humble, one says. This one boasts. They make no claims to control. They nudge, they coax, they wait. One woman recalls a winter when the air stayed damp for weeks and every jar grew loud with bubbles. Her mother told stories to keep everyone from worrying, tales of river stones that learned patience from slow water, of cats who chose the warmest lid and thus became wise. A fringed tidbit emerges between their chuckles. Her mother also tapped each lid with the end of a chopstick and thanked the jar by name. Did it help? The woman shrugs. It helped the people. Sometimes that is the only help that matters. A child appears at the steps and sits on the bottom one, hugging his knees, listening as if to a fire. The first keeper flicks a glance his way and slides the basket closer, letting him see a neat stack of paper tags. She explains to you and to the child, by pretending not to, that notes on the cords are a kind of gentle calendar. First frost, midday sun, quiet moon. Words remember what noses forget, she says. The child absorbs this without speaking, as children do. Whether such tags were always kept, or grew common only after ink and paper became easier to spare, remains a point the old accounts do not settle. Hands remembered before words did. They drift from method to memory. One describes the weight of a favorite stone, smooth as the back of a spoon, heavy as 2 apples. Another names a jar by the place it once cracked and was mended. The seam by the ear, she calls it, touching the jar's shoulder as if it could hear. You realize that this cellar holds more than food. It keeps the measure of lives. The season an elder's hands stopped lifting lids. The year a cousin married and carried 2 small jars to a new courtyard. The autumn when the chilies were thin-skinned and sweet, and every pace turned a shade brighter. A mainstream fact returns like a steady drumbeat. Sea salt is prized for its clarity, and most households will barter dearly to secure enough before the cold. The women speak of salt as if it were a relative who lives far away and visits once a year with gifts. They taste a grain on the tongue and nod in unison, approving its clean bite. Then they slip back into story. One tells of a winter lullaby that mentions jars by number, singing them to sleep, so cats will nap on warm lids and thieves' mice. Not men will keep their distance. She sings a line under her breath, and the tune seems to fit the cellar's width exactly. Historians still argue whether such songs began as work chants or bedtime verses or something between, adapted in each house to match the number of jars near the wall. No one has caught the first version. Perhaps there wasn't one. Perhaps the song is whatever keeps time with the cord's pull and the lid's soft settling. The conversation slides softly into instruction again. Scissors laid dull side down so they won't startle a lid. Cords retied in the morning when fibers are calm. Paste spread with the back of the hand so the ridges feel even. The child on the stair copies the motions in the air, practicing without tools. The second keeper notices and, without fanfare, hands over a scrap of cord. The child knots and unknots in slow concentration. In this cellar, teaching arrives disguised as tidying. A small sound breaks the steady hush. A lid kisses its rim after a tiny shift. All 3 of you pause, smiling for no reason but the rightness of it. Good jar. Someone murmurs, not because praise can change clay, but because praise can change people, and people change the work. The bench accepts another quiet minute. Time stretches and thins like steam. They speak at last of uncertainty, and the admission feels like a tidy bowl placed at the center of the bench. How long to rest the salted leaf before rinsing? How thick to spread the paste near the core? Which day welcomes stone? Which day asks for patience without weight? The answers vary by hand, by wall, by winter. The women accept this with a peace that scholars sometimes cannot. Listen. The first says, tapping the jar lightly with her nail. The jar tells you when it is ready to be left alone. Whether jars truly tell, or hands simply learn to hear what they already decided, remains a question that keeps both kitchens and books busy. The child tucks the cord into a pocket. The keepers rise, their knees speaking softly. One adjusts a mat with the heel of her palm. The other straightens a tag so its brushstroke faces forward. They leave the bench as they found it. Empty, warm where they sat, dusted with the smallest salt glitter that settles everywhere in this place. You stay a breath longer, feeling how the stories hang in the cellar like the scent of ginger light, warming, not meant to impress, only meant to keep company. Above ground, talk often tries to be important. Here, it tries to be useful, which is another way of being kind. You stand, brush your sleeves, and follow the narrow strip of matting between the rows. Behind you, the jars return to their own language. A small fizz, a quiet exhale, the lid's contented rest. In the dimmer corner where the wall curves, two lidded pails sit like quiet moons, their wooden hoops dark with old damp. When you lift a lid, a breath rises that is different from the jar's red perfume. It is pale and clean, the scent of salt that has learned leaf and thyme. The liquid below is cloudy, not from neglect but from long use, a soft milkiness that tells you this brine has already worked a season and has been kept to teach the next. You kneel and tilt the pail. The surface ruffles, then smooths to glass. A wooden ladle rests across the rim, its bowl stained a faint amber from years of dipping. You slide it through the liquid and lift. It streams in a slender thread back into itself, leaving the ladle's lip shining. The taste on your tongue is round and sure, salt first, then a gentle sour, then the memory of cabbage and radish, and the low whisper of garlic. This is not water that merely remembers the sea. It is water that remembers winter, and households, and patience. A mainstream fact belongs to these pails. Many cellars keep a measure of last season's brine to begin the new season's jars, believing the old will help the young find their way. A ladle or two may be stirred into fresh salt water to give it a path, as the keepers say. Not every household does this, and not for every recipe, but the habit is common enough that pails like these have their own place on the floor and their own lids to keep them modest. The brine is never used unthinking. It is tasted first, judged for cleanness, given a task only if it seems willing and sound. You set the ladle aside and feel the grain of the pail's staves under your fingers. The hoops creak when pressed, a soft voice from seasoned wood. At the bottom of the pail, small crystals glint salt that settled when the room ran cool. A keeper shows you a cloth bundle tied into the pail's handle, a pinch of clean ash tucked in linen, used to settle stray flecks when the brine grows hazy. She will swish it through, let it rest, then lift it out and leave the liquid to clear. Whether the ash truly clarifies or merely pleases the eye is uncertain. She shrugs and says her mother did it, and the brine always behaved after. The second pail holds a different note. Its scent leans more toward radish and less toward leaf, and when you taste it, the sour is a touch bolder. The keeper says this one is for quick pickles and turning greens, short journeys, she calls them, when there is no wish to wait an entire moon for flavor to settle. The first pail, quieter and deeper, is for the long keep. The distinction is not written on any board. It is kept in the mouth, in the memory of tongues that can tell a whisper from a word. Historians still argue how common it was, long ago, to teach new brine with old. In some court records and household notes, strong brine is poured away at season's end, never saved lest it carry forward any trouble. In other tellings, especially from smaller yards where nothing good is wasted, the brine is treasured like a steady elder and invited to sit at the first mixing of the year. The documents are shy with detail, and the truth likely bends by valley, by winter, by the confidence of the keepers who tended the jars. You dip the ladle again, but this time do not taste. You listen. The thread of falling brine makes a thin music against the pail's side, a silver sound in the brown room. The keeper smiles without looking up and says that on calm days, good brine falls in one strand. When it breaks into drops, the room is restless. Whether this is a test of luck or merely of hand and angle, you cannot say, yet you pour more slowly and the strand grows whole, and the small, unnecessary satisfaction of it settles your shoulders. A fringed tidbit flits through the cellar light. Some households name their brine, not in a serious way, no prayers, no offerings, but with nicknames that catch a year's character. Moon brine, if it was saved on a night of thin silver. Stone brine, if a child carried the pail with a favorite river stone inside to teach it patience. A grandmother once called hers stubborn aunt, because every quick pickle she made with it wanted to turn into a long one. The names are not kept on any tag. They live in jokes and in the way hands reach for one pail before another. Near the pails, a small tripod stands with a square of woven cloth stretched over it. When the brine grows tired, a word the keepers use for off smells or dull taste, it is poured through the cloth to lift away any stray cloud. The cloth is rinsed in hot water, then dried in the dim sun that finds the cellar mouth in afternoon. You run a knuckle over the weave and feel the strength still in it. The cloth has the hue of old straw and the patient dignity of a tool that does one thing well. You ask how the brine is judged strong enough for new work. The keeper answers by dipping her forefinger and touching a drop to the inside of her wrist. "It should speak without shouting," she says. She means that the salt must be present and the sour ready, but neither should command the other. In some villages, an old test is remembered. Float a clean chip of wood on the surface and watch how it rides. If it lies too proud, the brine is too heavy. If it sinks too readily, the brine is weak. Whether this test began here or wandered from pickling pots used for other foods, scholars debate. Still, a neatly whittled chip rests on the pail's rim, smooth from many floatings. The pails themselves have their stories. One shows a dark band where liquid stood in a year when the rains were generous and the brine was kept fuller for longer. Another bears shallow knife marks on its lid from a time someone dressed chilies too near and set the knife down without thinking. The marks remain, a harmless reminder that nothing in this corner is ever entirely separate from anything else. The same hands lift lids, turn leaves, and test the songs that falling brine will sing. You learn that not all saved brine is kept through the heat. When spring thins and summer fattens, some families give their pails a rest, pouring the last of the season into a cooking pot for soups that want a steady hand of salt and sour. Others feed a small measure to the yard's soil, believing it thanks the ground that gave the cabbage. Whether earth likes such gifts is unknown. The habit survives in houses that speak kindly to plots and walls alike. A mainstream detail returns like a tide. Sea salt is the spine of every pail. Without it, brine is only memoryless water. The keepers point to small sacks stacked high on a shelf, coarse crystals from distant shores, traded for when the leaves were still tight on the field. They dissolve slower than fine-grained salt, and the pails are patient with them. The crystals sink and soften, and the brine learns steadfastness again. You settle the lids back. The wood fits the pails' mouths with the modest certainty of long partners. Before you go, you dip the ladle and offer one drop back to the surface, an old courtesy learned from watching other hands. A promise that what is taken returns in its time. The drop lands and opens into a ring that widens, fades, and disappears, as if the pail had nodded. You stand and smooth your palms on your sleeves, and the cellar keeps breathing. In another week, the brine in these pails may be folded into new water, quiet voices lending counsel to young jars, or it may be deemed too proud and be thanked and set to other uses. The choice will be made by taste, by season, by the wall's mood and the keeper's ear. You take one last look at the pails, plain, patient, faithful, and feel the steady comfort of knowing that even water can carry wisdom if you let it. A small sack rests on the bench near the cellar mouth, its cloth stiff with fine dust that glitters like pale frost when the lamp leans toward it. You loosen the knot and dip 2 fingers inside. Coarse crystals slide against your skin irregular, some sharp as broken shells, some blunt as milled grain. You lift a single grain to your tongue. It is clean and blunt, not bitter, the kind of salt that speaks first and then steps aside, letting every other flavor do its work. The keeper beside you smiles, the sort of smile meant for a reliable friend. She says the sack came from far coasts where shallow pans drink sun and wind. There, brine spreads thin as silk over flat beds, and, day after day, the sky boils water without flame until the crystals rise. A mainstream truth is steady here. Sea salt from the southern shores has long moved inland by cart and shoulder and boat, precious enough to draw lines on maps and in memories. When the rivers run high, boats carry it deep among the hills. When the roads run dry, oxen sway under its weight, and dust follows the caravan like a faithful dog. You knead the sack's corner between your fingers and feel how the crystals crack faintly against one another. Some families pour new salt through a reed sieve, separating the larger shards for brine and the finer dust for salting leaves by hand. The keeper lifts a wooden spoon from the shelf and shows you a recess worn into its bowl by years of measuring. This much for a basin, she says, not as law, but as a starting place a house has learned to trust. From the open sack rises a scent that is barely scent at all, a breath of tide cooled by distance. It is not fishy or loud. It is the quiet of a strand after the sun has gone. The hush left when waves finish speaking to stones. You pinch another crystal and crush it between forefinger and thumb. It yields with a dry squeak, and the dust clings to your skin. The story of this salt does not belong only to this house. It has brushed the hands of harvesters who rake the pans at dusk, of traders who stack the white into neat hills under woven covers, of scribes who mark weights on thin sticks or brush notes for the storehouse, of boatmen who know which bend in the river scolds with hidden stones. Scholars still argue the exact seasons when the state first took a firm hand in the salt's journey, whether levies and tallies came early and strictly, or grew in fits and starts as rulers learned how steady salt makes a kingdom. The record leaves rooms of silence. Taxes leave clearer footprints than kitchens, and kitchens leave clearest marks in the mouth. You remember hearing that in thin years, salt was traded for strong paper, for lengths of cloth that promised warmth, for copper that would be melted and hammered into other shapes. A careful notebook in some distant office might record such exchanges, but here the memory sits in proverbs. Fine salt, fine winter, an aunt says. Poor salt, poor temper, a cousin answers, and both nod as if this settles more than 1 year's worries. A bowl of good salt was once a wedding gift in a valley you visited, wrapped in reed matting with a twig of pine laid on top for steadiness. The bride raised the bundle, smiled, and the old women approved. You let a few grains fall into your palm and consider their shapes. Not all white is the same white. Some crystals hold a faint rose at their heart where the brine lay thicker. Some gleam like hoarfrost. Some slump a little, softened by a breath of damp. The keeper prefers the ones that break clean and leave no bitterness, a mark of salt dried with patience, not scorched by haste. She pours a handful into a shallow dish, then tilts the dish so the crystals slide. They hiss softly, like sand whispering secrets to wood. A fringe tidbit wanders into the telling. Travelers say a smart keeper carries a pinch of salt in a small cloth at the throat during storm season, so the air will mind its manners. In some houses, a circle of salt is scattered under a newly placed jar, so that mice feel shy and look elsewhere for a path. Whether either practice works beyond settling nerves is a question no ledger keeps. Still, small cloth packets hang from a few pegs, and you notice a faint ring of white under one jar near the door. The keeper measures a spoon into a basin and stirs water until the crystals vanish. Heavy enough to hold leaf, light enough to move, she says, testing the brine between forefinger and thumb. A mainstream note returns like tide. Coarse sea salt, low in harsh minerals, helps fermentation keep its even temper. Too fine a salt dissolves in a blink and can make a hand careless. Too impure a salt brings bitterness that lingers where it isn't wanted. This is the sort of knowledge that refuses to wear a neat number and instead wears the lines on a palm. You ask how the salt arrived this time. She tells you a cousin met the caravan at a market by the river mouth, a place where baskets of dried fish, jars of oil, and stacks of white cakes of salt lean against one another like neighbors. The cousin traded bolts of paper and a promise of help at harvest for 2 sacks, then followed the river's shoulder home, letting the barge do most of the work. When the water grew narrow and stones lifted their backs, the sacks moved to an ox cart, and later to human backs on the steepest paths. Salt walks, she says, amused by her own phrase. It just lets water and hooves do the hard part first. Historians still puzzle over whether inland folk once favored mineral salt dug from old beds or always sought sea-made crystals where they could. The evidence is muddy. Broken clay pans near the coast, lists from storehouses, tall tales from valleys that boast of springs tasting like the far ocean. The cellar does not argue. It knows only that certain sacks produce brine that stays clear, lids that sit quiet, and leaves that answer kindly to long weeks in the dark. A boy slips in from the stair and asks, too casual to be anything but hopeful, whether he may have a grain. The keeper tips a pinch into his palm. He places one crystal on his tongue and closes his eyes, as if salt has its own stories to tell children. He nods solemnly. Good, he says, which is as wide a word as any learned speech. He rubs his finger and watches the dust shine in the lamplight. It sparkles, he adds, as if this were the true measure. You fold the sack's mouth and retie the knot with a cross and tuck, the same pattern used on jar cords. The cloth is rough against your skin, and the knot sits obediently in your fist before you let it go. A few stray crystals cling to the fabric. The keeper flicks them free with a nail, saving them as if each were a bead of coin. In lean seasons, the leftover dust is swept together and used to season broth so nothing is wasted. Another pinch drops into your palm. You bring it to your lips one last time. The grain cracks. Your mouth wakes. Then, as quickly, the directness fades, leaving only clarity. You imagine it traveling once more, from sky and shallow water to rake and basket, from basket to barge, from barge to road, from road to cellar, from cellar to jar, from jar to bowl, a quiet line of work that tethers coasts to kitchens and makes winter taste like something more than survival. You set the sack back on the bench and press the knot flat with your thumb. In another hour, those crystals will dissolve into the basin waiting near the mats, and the leaf will learn them the way a river learns its banks. Whether the salt's exact birthplace matters to the jar is something scholars still debate, chasing names of pans and seasons through thin papers. The jar will accept what is clean and steady and repay it with calm. You breathe in the faint tide ghost that lingers at the sack's mouth and feel the cellar quietly approve. On a narrow shelf above the bench, small pouches sit in a neat row, each tied with cord the color of old straw. Their cloth is stained here and there, but the knots are tight, their ends trimmed square. You untie one and find it filled with pale, flat seeds that rattle softly when shaken. The scent rises warm and nutty, like dry soil after sun, with a faint echo of green. Perilla seeds, the keeper says, for days when kimchi is meant to be generous. She opens another pouch and tips a few slender kernels into her palm. These are pine nuts, pale ivory with a shine as if they've been brushed. Their smell is subtle but carries a memory of resin and cool shade. She explains they're added sparingly to certain jars, not for every household, not for every season, to make a batch richer, softer on the tongue. A mainstream truth underlies her words. While most kimchi is meant to keep well and feed many mouths plainly, some is prepared for festival tables, New Year's mornings, or the visit of an important guest. In those jars, a scattering of perilla or pine nut turns preservation into something nearer to a gift. The pouches vary in size. Some are small enough to fit in a closed fist. Others would take both hands to hold. The cloth is soft from years of handling, and some bear tiny brush strokes marking contents, though most keepers know by feel and scent alone. She tells you the seeds are roasted lightly before storing, not enough to cook them, only enough to chase away dampness. A shallow pan over low coals, a careful stir until the air smells rounder. This is enough to keep them steady until they're needed. You pour a few perilla seeds into your palm. They are small ovals, some speckled, some smooth. When crushed between your teeth, they release oil with a flavor like green leaves leaning toward pepper. She says the oil is what softens the spice in a mouthful, rounds it, makes the heat feel less like a blade and more like a warm cloth. In colder months, the oil feels heavier, more welcome. Whether this is truly a matter of season or simply of habit, historians still discuss. Some argue the seeds were always seasonal luxuries, others that they were common until lean years pushed them aside. From a deeper pouch, she lifts a twist of paper. Inside lies a pinch of dried chrysanthemum petals, gold faded to parchment. She admits these are not for flavor so much as for brightness, a quiet lift in a jar otherwise meant to endure. Some call it superstition, some call it craft. The petals appear mostly in family recipes with long memories, where no one asks whether they're needed. They're simply part of what makes the jar taste like home. A fringe tidbit slips into her telling. Her grandmother swore that adding 7 pine nuts to a festival jar would ensure 7 blessings in the coming year, but that adding 8 would tip the balance and invite quarrels. The numbers, she admits, may have more to do with memory than with fate. 7 is easy to count, easy to repeat. Still, she has never dared to add 8, and neither did her grandmother. She offers you a pine nut from her palm. It is soft between your teeth, almost creamy, its flavor unfolding slowly. You can imagine how it would hide among the leaves and spice, a small surprise for the tongue to find. She explains that such additions are always placed by hand, never stirred in with the paste, to be sure they are spaced well and not bunched into a single mouthful. The care in this step is less about fairness than about intention. Each jar should carry the thought that went into it. The pouch's drawstrings are of twisted hemp, their fibers polished from fingers. When she ties one shut, she makes a small loop at the knot's base. This, she says, is so the pouch can hang from a peg if the shelf grows too crowded. A row of such pouches hangs nearby, each casting a shadow like a small bell. The air around them smells faintly of the sum of all they hold: nut, herb, seed, memory. Historians still question when these special occasion editions became distinct from everyday kimchi making. In earlier records, there is little division between what was festive and what was practical. Preservation was preservation, and flavor, if richer, was a happy accident. Over time, it seems, jars began to be made with intent for certain days, and with them came these careful handfuls of extra taste. You reach for a different pouch and find dried slices of jujube, their deep red wrinkled into crescents. She says they're sometimes tucked into the top layer of a jar for weddings or first birthday feasts. Their sweetness is faint, more scent than taste once the winter has done its work. But the sight of them in the jar signals care. Whether such fruits were always within reach or once traveled far to get here is uncertain, but their place in the cellar feels settled. A last pouch holds something you don't recognize: tiny, bead-like seeds the color of ash. She admits she doesn't use them anymore. They belong to her mother's recipe, and the flavor never felt hers to tend. Yet she keeps them, if only to remember the scent of the hands that once measured them out. The pouch smells faintly bitter, faintly sweet, like the edge of a story told in a kitchen you'll never see. You return each pouch to its place, pressing air from the cloth before tying the knots. The shelf looks modest again, its treasures hidden. But you know now that inside each plain shape is something chosen, something spared from ordinary days for the sake of the rare. You imagine the moment weeks from now when a lid is lifted and a single pine nut floats in the brine, or a perilla seed clings to a fold of leaf, a small sign that the jar was made with a day in mind, not just a winter. As you step away, you feel the faint oil from the seeds still on your fingertips. It carries a quiet fragrance, and you keep it there a little longer before brushing it off. The cellar holds many such traces, flavors, and scents meant for special tables, resting now in the patient dark until the right moment comes to wake them. Near the far wall, where the jars stand half in shadow, a striped cat is curled atop a broad clay lid. Its paws are tucked under, tail looped neatly, eyes half closed in a slow, patient blink. The lid holds a faint warmth, not from the sun which never reaches here, but from the slow work of the jar beneath. The cat's body has learned this spot, returning to it in every season when the cellar is quiet and the lids feel like steady stones. The keeper, seeing your gaze, smiles without looking up from her work. They keep watch, she says, as if that is reason enough to let the animal stay. In a way, it is. A mainstream truth lies here. Cellars attract life besides the jars: mice seeking grain, insects drawn to damp. A cat that makes its bed on a lid is not merely resting. It is laying claim, sending a silent message to anything small and hungry that this place already has a guardian. You watch the slow rise and fall of the cat's breathing. It is neither curious nor alarmed by your presence. Now and then, its tail tip twitches, but it does not move. One ear turns toward the faint hiss of brine in a nearby jar, then toward the soft pad of the keeper's steps, then back again. The air around it seems to grow more still, as though the jars themselves have agreed to let the animal share their watch. The cat shifts slightly, kneading the lid with its paws. The clay gives no softness, yet the motion continues, a habit from kittenhood, perhaps, or a way of settling the weight evenly. A fringe tidbit comes to mind. Some families say a cat who sleeps on a jar will keep its contents calm, just as it keeps mice from crossing the floor. Others claim the jar is closest to the cat ferment more gently, as if soothed by the animal's warmth. Whether this is truth or affection disguised as belief is uncertain. Scholars have no measure for such things, though they note the custom is not rare. You step closer, careful not to jar the jar. The lid's surface bears faint paw marks from older naps, smudges in the thin dust, a single claw line along the edge. The cord binding the lid is intact, undisturbed, the knot lying flat despite the extra weight. The keeper says the cat has learned to settle without shifting the cover. It is a skill earned over many winters, like knowing where to place your hands when lifting a heavy jar so it doesn't rock. A bowl, empty now, sits on the floor near the wall. Brine fish scraps, the keeper explains, so it hunts less where it shouldn't. The exchange is simple. A few morsels for loyalty, for company, for the kind of attention only a cat gives quiet. Selective, never hurried. In return, the jars are free from whiskered visitors who might gnaw a cord or scatter a lid in their search for warmth. Historians still debate the role of cats in older households. Were they kept chiefly for pest control, or did they slip naturally into the folds of domestic life, sleeping where it pleased them? Records rarely mention them except in passing. Yet pottery fragments and old paintings sometimes show a feline curled near stores of food. Whether these were symbols or everyday sights is unclear. What is clear is that their presence here is older than anyone remembers needing to explain it. The cat stretches at last, rising to its feet. It pads once in a circle on the lid, then steps down to the matting with the soundless grace of something that owns its every move. It walks between jars as if on a route memorized long ago, brushing its side against the cool clay now and then. The keeper says it always visits the same 3 jars before leaving, which 3 changes from year to year, for reasons only the cat knows. A small superstition clings to this habit. If a cat circles a jar and lingers, some keepers will mark that jar's cord with a knot of red thread to keep the luck in. Whether the cat's choice has any meaning beyond comfort, no one can say. Still, you notice a single red knot on one lid's cord as the animal passes, and you wonder if it was tied for this very reason. The cat pauses near the steps, glancing back once. Its eyes catch the lamplight in 2 brief coins of green. Then it slips upward into the brighter air, leaving the cellar to its slower breath. The lid it left behind holds no mark except a faint warmth under your palm when you reach to test it. You stand a moment longer, looking at that jar. The cord is snug, the lid unmoved, the air around it still, carrying the faint memory of fur and sunless heat. Perhaps the jars do notice such things. Perhaps not. But the watch has been kept, and the cellar feels no less secure for it. Outside the cellar, the air shifts brighter, thinner, edged with the scent of frost melting under a pale sun. You step through the doorway and into the yard, where bamboo mats lean against the low wall like a line of sunbathers resting after long work. Their pale strips catch the light in alternating bands, shadows pooling in the weave. The wind moves through them with a faint shushing sound, as if it were turning the pages of a quiet book. Each mat is the width of a jar's shoulder and twice as long, woven tight with fine strips of split bamboo. The keeper explains they were used just yesterday to cover the freshly sealed lids, protecting them while the brine settled into stillness. Now, washed and drying, they hang in an even row. A mainstream truth rests here. Bamboo mats are as much a part of a cellar's work as cords and stones. They keep debris from falling into open jars during packing, help regulate temperature during sudden weather shifts, and can be laid over a mat of straw to wick away excess damp. You walk along the row, touching the edges. Some mats are stiff and new, their strips pale and smooth. Others are softened by seasons of use, edges frayed, and strands darkened where hands have gripped them often. The older ones curl slightly as they dry, the bamboo remembering the roundness of jar lids. A faint salt film clings to several, glittering where the light strikes just right. The keeper takes down one mat and turns it so you can see the weave. Fine, narrow strips run lengthwise, while slightly thicker ones cross at intervals, the pattern simple and unchanging. Strong enough to last, she says, but light enough to lift with one hand. She runs a finger along a darker strip. This one came from the grove by the north slope. It stays firm longer. Whether bamboo from one slope truly differs from another, or whether this is the eye of long habit, historians still argue. The records give little on the matter, beyond noting that bamboo has been cut for kitchen and storage work for centuries. At the far end, a mat hangs lower than the rest. Its weave is patched with strips of paler bamboo, stitched in with twine. The repair is tidy, but it shows plainly. The keeper says her grandmother insisted that patching was better than weaving new. A mended mat knows its work. A fringe tidbit. Some houses believe that patched mats should be used only on jars already in good health, lest the jar inherit the weakness that once needed repair. Others scoff at the idea and use them anywhere, saying the only thing a jar inherits is the keeper's care. A light breeze stirs the mats, and their shadows ripple across the packed earth. You notice how they are spaced just far enough apart to keep from tangling in the wind. The keeper nods at your observation space is as important as sunlight, she says. Crowded mats dry unevenly, and dampness invites mildew, which no jar thanks you for. You crouch to look at a mat lying flat on a low bench, drying in the weaker sun near the wall. Its surface smells faintly of chili and garlic, not enough to be strong, just enough to remind you of the work it shared. The scent will fade in a day, leaving only the clean, dry smell of bamboo. You trace the grain with a fingertip, feeling where it has grown rough from where. Historians still wonder whether mats like these were always part of jar work, or whether they came later, borrowed from other household uses. Some argue they were first meant for drying herbs or fish, later pressed into service for fermentation. Others insist they began here and only later spread to other tasks. The truth is lost between these uses, and the mats themselves are no help. They bear no marks, no stamps, no memory except in frayed edges and the faint polish where a jar lid once pressed. The keeper flips one mat over to show you the underside. A smear of dried brine marks the center, a soft gray patch against the pale bamboo. This one worked hard last winter, she says. You imagine it laid across a line of jars while snow pressed down outside, the brine inside murmuring against the lids. A fringe belief slips into her voice. Mats dried under a clear moon will last a season longer. She doesn't say she believes it outright, but she hangs them in the open yard whenever the night promises to be cloudless. The next morning, she says, they feel different in the hands, less tired, somehow. Whether the moon truly stiffens bamboo or the keeper simply likes the thought of it, the mats hang in the light either way. One by one, the keeper checks each mat, flipping and adjusting so all sides feel the sun. She leans them back against the wall, just so, the bottom edge resting on smooth stones to keep them from picking up damp from the earth. The line of them makes a quiet fence of pale gold, each casting a shadow that shifts as the morning lengthens. You stand back and take in the scene. The yard is still, save for the small sway of bamboo in the breeze. The air smells of earth and drying fiber, of last night's frost giving way to sun. Somewhere inside, the jars wait under their cords and mats, undisturbed. Out here, their companions rest in the light, gathering their own patience for the next time they are called to cover and guard the slow work below. You return inside just as the keepers begin the quiet ritual of closing what has been opened. A stack of clean lids waits on the low-bored domes of clay, the color of wet bark, each wearing a faint ring of salt from past seasons like a pale collar. The women move as if time itself might bruise. One wipes a jar's rim with a square of boiled cloth. Another checks the cord for fray, and a third warms a small bowl of ceiling clay with her palms until it yields. The cellar, which has been full of looking and listening, turns toward the business of being sure. You kneel beside the nearest jar to watch closely. First, the rim. A fingertip travels the circle, feeling for grit invisible to the eye. Any grain here would become a high point, and a high point becomes a leak. A damp cloth follows, smoothing until the clay shines a little. The keeper tilts the lid so its edge kisses the rim, then lowers it slowly, letting air leave in a soft exhale. When lid meets jar, the sound is not a thud but a muffled answer, as if two quiet stones had agreed upon something. A mainstream fact settles under the moment. These earthenware jars, onggi, are made to breathe. Their walls are not glass slick but full of tiny sealed pores from the mix of clay and grit, allowing gases to ease outward while keeping the cellar's air from intruding. A good lid does not clamp airtight like a cooking pot. It rests true and even, with just enough mercy for for the jar's slow respiration. Fermentation continues in that mercy, neither suffocated nor left exposed. The cord comes next, a cross of twisted reed or hemp, looped beneath the lid's ear like nubs, then drawn until the lid settles deeper into its seat. The keeper's pull is firm but not punishing. Tight enough to remember, she murmurs. Loose enough to forgive. She ties the knot that every jar in this place wears. Loop, turn, tuck, a pattern that opens with one sure pull even if the cord swells in damp. She flattens the knot with her thumb so it lies low and will not catch a cat's paw or a hurried sleeve. Sealing clay waits in her other hand, a thumb-sized piece kneaded with a pinch of salt. She rolls it into a thin rope and lays it along the seam where lid meets rim. Another keeper follows with a wet finger, smoothing the rope into a neat gasket that glints in the lamplight. Some households call this closing the breath, not to stop it, but to teach it the proper path. In wetter valleys, the seam may be left uncoated. In drier ones, it is always dressed. Historians still argue whether this ribbon of clay is an old habit born of harsh winters or a later refinement that spread with fashion. Records speak of sealing without always saying how kitchens, as ever, keep better memory in hands than in ink. The final test is sound. A small pebble, chosen earlier from the shelf, taps 3 places around the lid's edge: north, east, west. Then the keeper presses lightly at the 4th. The notes answer with the same soft fullness. Had one ringed thin and hollow, they would have lifted and begun again, hunting the grit they missed or the place where clay sat uneven. Satisfied, she wipes her fingers on a cloth dark with old salt, then hangs the pebble back on its nail by a loop of twine, like a little bell retired until the next check. A row behind you. The same steps repeat in a second rhythm, then a third. A faint chorus rises, cloth over clay, cord sliding through fingers, knots breathing tight, the wet whisper of smoothing. Now and then, a lid settles with a tiny shift and makes the cellar's favorite sound, a hush that lands between breath and thought, small enough to be missed if you are not listening for it. Everyone pauses for that sound. It means the circle is true. A fringe tidbit edges into the work as a smile. One keeper presses a single rice grain into the seam before smoothing it flat. For a steady year, she says. In her grandmother's house, the grain went always at the southern point. Elsewhere, the east was favored so the morning would remember to be kind. Whether the grain does anything more than please the person who places it is beyond measuring. Yet it costs nothing and offends no one, so a few seams in this cellar carry a secret kernel of hope. Not every jar closes without protest. At one, the lid lists by the width of a hair. They lift, wipe, check the rim again, and find the culprit. A thread of reed left behind when yesterday's cord was trimmed. It looks too small to matter, but the keeper lays it in your palm so you can feel its stubbornness. A lid remembers every error, she says, and hums once while she cleans the circle. The hum is not a tune you recognize more, a line drawn in air to keep the hands from hurrying. On a low tray, tags of thin wood wait with fresh ink. Each bears the date, a brief note, quiet sky, after frost, 3rd pot of paste, and a mark showing which household mixed the jar. The tag is threaded onto the cord, resting just below the knot. Main ledgers live in a wrapped book near the stairs, but these little tags stand closer to the work. Scholars have written that such notations grew common only when paper and ink became easier to spare. Others point to older wooden tallies and say the habit is older than anyone thinks, only the material changed. The jars decline to clarify. They keep both memory and indifference equally well. You try a lid yourself. The keeper watches without correcting, which is its own instruction. The clay is heavier than it looks, and the last finger's breath asks for patience. You lower, listening, then feel the moment when weight gives way to rest. The cord bites your palm when you pull. You ease off a shade, remembering, forgive. Your knot lands slightly crooked. You untie, retie, flatten. The pebble's 3 taps speak in one voice. The keeper nods, not for pride but for relief. One more circle made whole. Uncertainty lingers at the edges of even practiced work, and the keepers admit it without shame. How much clay is enough at the seam? How tightly should the cord carry a jar through a week of wind that no one hears down here? Does a lid benefit from a finger's turn at midday when the weather rises? Or is it better not to disturb what sleeps? The answers travel by valley, by cellar, by mood of winter. Historians still argue whether old manuals, sparse as they are, described an ideal few kitchens or the many. The women here argue with no one. They do what their hands agree upon, and they change it when their hands change their minds. When the last lid is set and the last cord trimmed, the room feels different, less like a workshop and more like a chapel after candles are snuffed. You become aware of small symmetries, knots all lying in the same direction, tags facing outward, mats squared to the rows. None of it makes flavor by itself, and yet flavor seems to grow best where order can rest. The keepers rinse their fingers in a basin and wipe them dry on cloths already white with salt. One presses her palm briefly to each of the jars she has closed, a gesture so quick it could be mistaken for stretching. If it is thanks, it is a quiet kind. If it is habit, it is a kind one. Either way, the cellar receives it and offers back its even breath. You step to the aisle and look along the row. The lids are a soft geography of brown hills under low weather, cords drawn like footpaths between them. Somewhere inside, leaves relax under brine, paste settle, and tiny bubbles plan their slow ascent. The work of closing has not ended the work. It has only given it a safe room. At the threshold, you glance back. A single lid reflects the lamp in a dull coin of light. You remember the sequence: wipe, lower, listen, tie, smooth, test, and feel how each motion braided with the next until no step announced itself. Outside, frost is surrendering to the day. Down here, the jars have surrendered nothing. They are sealed enough to keep faith, open enough to keep breathing. The cooking hut sits a few steps from the cellar door, a squat shape with smoke slipping from a low vent, as if the roof were exhaling. You push aside the reed curtain and enter a slow warmth that smells of ash and broth. The hearth is only a shallow pit ringed by stones, its coals banked low, their glow the color of dried persimmon. Above them rests a black earthen pot whose rim sweats in small beads that catch the light and vanish. The sound here is different from the cellar's hush, a patient bubble, a whisper of steam against a wooden lid, the soft tick of settling embers. You lift the lid with a cloth-wrapped hand, letting the steam rise and bloom against your face. It carries the sour of well-aged leaf, tempered now by heat until it smells rounder, friendlier. Beneath the steam, cabbage folds sigh and fall back into the broth. Slivers of radish drift like pale tiles, and threads of red paste trace faint lines through the surface before dissolving. A mainstream truth finds its place in this pot. Winter kitchens have long called for stews made from the jars, turning preserved leaf into warmth, not merely for hunger, but for comfort that spreads from mouth to hands. The stew here is not showy. It is simply what the jars knew they would become. You set the lid aside and stir with a wooden spoon worn thin along one edge. The spoon's bowl scrapes the pot's inner curve and finds the sweet place where the heat is strongest. The broth answers with a deeper bubble, then quiets. Accepting the new path your stirring sets. You taste. The first touch is salt, then the gentle sour from months in the dark, then a soft heat that does not boast. Somewhere in the depth is a whisper of smoke from the hearth, as if the fire contributed a seasoning of its own. The keeper ladles a measure into a shallow bowl and sets it near the stones to cool. She adds a lump of soft bean curd, the color of pale straw, sliced thick enough to hold shape. It slips into the broth and wobbles once, then goes still. She says the curd steadies the stew sour so it sits kindly on a cold morning. Some add pieces of pork or dried fish instead, depending on the day's luck. Some add nothing at all, letting leaf and brine speak without company. Historians still discuss when meat or fish became regular guests in winter stews, whether such richness belonged mostly to prosperous houses or came and went with markets and seasons. The pot keeps its counsel and cooks whoever is welcomed. While the bowl steams, the keeper raises the lid from a smaller pot pushed to the hearth's edge. Inside, fermented bean paste thins into a glossy brown with water and a few slices of garlic. She takes a spoonful and smears it along the side of the main pot just above the broth line. As it warms, it slips down on its own, leaving a trail of deeper savor. Whether this extra touch is tradition or the cook's private habit is not written anywhere. It feels like the kind of choice learned by mouth and remembered by wrist. A fringed tidbit survives in the hut's talk. An elder swore that stew made from a jar opened at dawn never quarrels, while a pot that begins at midday must listen to a lullaby to keep it from boasting. The keeper laughs at herself, then hums anyway, not a song with words, just a low thread of sound that lies across the simmer the way straw lies across a jar. You notice the bubbles grow smaller, more even, though you cannot say whether song or settling fire deserves the credit. The pot's rim gathers small islands of fat, tiny and round. With a spoon, you draw them toward the side and let them disappear against the clay. The broth clears a shade. The earthenware hisses a little where the liquid meets its hot skin. You can feel the breath of the pot in the way the steam rises, not in sudden gusts, but in a steady plume that fogs the reed curtain and dampens your sleeves. A basket of old kimchi sits on the bench, leaves cut short, their veins stained a red that time has turned toward rust. The keeper tips a handful into the pot, saying the stew welcomes the jars that have learned the cellar longest. A mainstream detail wears an apron here. Older leaf brings a deeper sour that heat softens into something almost sweet at the edges. Fresh leaf can be used, but it tends to argue with the fire, and the stew will spend its strength persuading it to sit down. She reaches to a shelf and pinches dried scallion greens into the steam. They wake like thin grass in a thaw, their scent bright in the warmth. A splash from the brine pail follows only a spoon or two to teach the pot the jar's voice. You think of the saved brine in the cellar and how its memory carries forward. A second pot nearer the coals holds rice gruel, thick and white. A ladle of it slips into the stew and turns the broth a shade cloudier, smoothing the sharpness the way fog softens a field. You sit on a low stool and watch the surface move. The cabbage lifts and settles like breathing. The curd edges soften to curves. A thin crack opens in one ember and shows a spine of light. The keeper's shadow moves across the wall, a gentle echo of her hands. She ladles a small bowl for herself, then one for you, setting them on the hearthstone where the heat will not rush them. She adds a scatter of toasted perilla seed to yours, just a pinch, and the bowl's scent leans toward nut and leaf. You take a sip that is more steam than liquid, then a second that lands on the tongue with purpose. The sour is awake, but not insistent. The salt is present, but not in command. The heat catches the back of your throat and then softens. You feel the warmth move outward, first to your jaw, then to your chest, spreading until your fingertips know it. In this moment, the cellar's slow work becomes something you can hold, and the winter beyond the hut notices you less. The keeper speaks without looking up. Stew tastes better on the second time it is heated, and better still on the third. You nod, recognizing a truth spoken in many kitchens. Flavors rest and find each other in the quiet between fires. Whether this improvement is chemistry or poetry or both is a matter for other rooms. Here, the pot simply waits until it is asked to speak again. Historians still wonder when this kind of winter stew became a household constant rather than an occasional answering of hunger. Was it born in court kitchens that had the luxury to simmer through long afternoons? Or in village huts like this one where everything had to justify the fuel it used? The writing that survives favors, lists, and measures, not the sound of a bubble, not the way steam can smell friendly. The question remains on the shelf with other jars of not knowing. A thin tile warms on the hearth's edge, ready for the next bowl to sit, without losing its heat to the air. The keeper tests the coals with a stick, nudging one forward to wake its heart. Sparks lift like a handful of tiny insects, then rest again. She sets the lid back but leaves it crooked, giving steam a narrow path. "Let it talk," she says. Not loudly, just enough. You finish your bowl and feel the warmth settle low and calm. The pot murmurs behind you, and the hut breathes along with it. You rinse your spoon in a basin of warm water, dry it on a cloth that smells faintly of smoke, and place it bowl down on the board, as the keepers do when they mean to return soon. Before you leave, you draw the tip of your spoon along the inner rim of the pot and taste the line. It gathers thicker, a little sweeter, a memory of all the bubbles that have passed. You set the lid more squarely, fold the reed curtain half closed, and step back into the cooler air. Behind you, the stew continues its quiet labor, turning winter into something that asks you to stay. The first taste is not a ceremony so much as a pause that everyone understands. A low table has been pulled close to the door, where the air moves a little, and two shallow bowls rest on it, each with a small mound of kimchi made just last month. The leaves are still bright, their red not yet folded into the deeper rust of long winter. A few threads of scallion peek through like green stitching. Someone has sliced a radish into thin half-moons and laid them alongside, as if the cabbage should have company on its first walk to the tongue. You sit on a cushion that sighs with old cotton and fold your legs in, careful not to jostle the bowls. The keeper sets a small dish of rice near your hand, not as a meal, but as a soft answer to the jar's sharpness. She places a pair of wooden chopsticks across the rim of your bowl and waits a moment, the way one does when letting water settle after it's been poured. The room has its own quiet now, different from the cellar's breath and the hearth's murmur. This quiet carries a thin thread of expectancy, a string drawn between leaf and mouth. You lift a single fold of cabbage with the tips of the chopsticks. Brine pearls cling and fall, marking the bowl in small, bright circles before they slip together and vanish. You lay the fold on your tongue and close your mouth without hurry. The first note is salt, clean and direct, followed by the green of cabbage still young. Then the paste wakes garlic steady, ginger round, chili warm, but not yet stern. The sour is a promise more than a presence, a path beginning rather than the road already traveled. A mainstream truth sits comfortably at this table. Small side dishes, set out not as decoration but as quiet company for rice, have long shaped the way a mouth moves through a meal. This kimchi is one such companion, never the whole story, yet always near the heart of it. Even young, it knows its role, to widen the rice, to give the broth a point of light, to make winter feel arranged rather than endured. The keeper watches the way your jaw works and nods once, approving not of your compliment you haven't offered one, but of your unhurried chewing. She takes her own first taste with fingers instead of sticks, pinching a smaller fold and lifting it to her mouth. The jar speaks truer to skin, she says, by which she means only that some habits run older than tools. A fringe tidbit follows as she wipes her fingertips on a cloth. In her grandmother's house, the first bright leaf of a new jar was carried to the threshold and held a moment toward the yard to greet the air. Sometimes the leaf was tucked under a pebble by the step. Sometimes it was simply eaten with a bow. Whether this greeting tempered temperament or merely pleased elders who loved neat beginnings is a question no tongue can settle. The pebble by that old step, she says, still bears a faint stain of red. You taste again. This time you chase the leaf with a pinch of rice. The grain loosens the paste, and the paste tightens the grain. The radish half-moon follows with a brisk, watery snap that lands like a fresh word in a familiar sentence. You understand why the young jars sit near the door. They are the voices that answer daily hunger without asking for ceremony. The older jars speak in paragraphs. These speak in good mornings. On the table, a small saucer holds just enough brine to shine. You tip the bowl and watch the surface pull itself level again. Some keepers like a spoon of this bright liquid drizzled over hot rice. Others sip it neat, as if salt and sour were a tonic, which, in a winter body, they are. Historians still argue whether this habit belongs to kitchens of comfort or of necessity, whether brine sipping began as thrift, to take nothing from the jar without honoring it, or as taste, because it pleases the mouth. The written record leaves little but an occasional note. The habit itself answers more convincingly than ink. The keeper adds a few toasted perilla seeds to your bowl, not many, only enough to whisper, and the oil rises through the heat. The chili's edge rounds, the garlic leans sweet for a heartbeat, and the cabbage tastes older than its weeks. You notice how small gestures change a mouthful's weather. A breath of seed, a single pine nut, a thread of dry jujube in the top layer. The cellar is full of such quiet levers that move more than their size suggests. From the doorway, a neighbor steps in, bows, and sits without asking if there is room. There is always room for the first taste. She brings news of the path, by the stream ice thinning, reeds rattling, and lays a sprig of pine on the table for steadiness. The three of you eat in the sequence the body picks for itself. Leaf, rice, broth from a waiting pot, then leaf again. No one speaks for a while. The conversation has been handed to the jars, and they are using it well. A small debate rises and fades with the steam. Should young kimchi be stirred through a pot at once or kept as a crisp side for a week before meeting heat? The neighbor prefers to hold it back, saying the early crunch keeps her temper civilized in late winter. The keeper shrugs and says the stew will teach even the young to sit kindly with others. Scholars still puzzle over when such preferences became regional habits or remained purely domestic. The lines on maps rarely answer questions that live and die at low tables. You lift the bowl to your lips and drink a little of the brine. It is cleaner than the cellar scent promised, lighter, with a fast finish that leaves your mouth awake. A chip of chili catches your lower lip. You press it there with your tongue and feel its warmth spread. The bowl's clay is cool where your fingers grip it, warm where the liquid has climbed. In the margin of your vision, you see the yard's bamboo mats leaning into the sun. Down the steps, the sealed jars do their hidden work. Up here, the work becomes taste and then memory. Another fringe habit surfaces. The neighbor taps her chopsticks twice on the rim of her bowl before reaching for more, a courtesy, she says, to tell the jar that what is taken will be returned in labor later. Whether this little knock travels into the cool air below or only reassures the knocker is anyone's guess. The rhythm pleases the ear, and that is often enough. A mainstream fact passes between sips and bites. The table is not a stage for a single dish to show off. It is a small landscape where many modest things keep each other company. The young kimchi is today's bright hill. It will not be the same hill tomorrow. By next week, the sour will be stronger, the heat steadier, the leaf less eager to crack between teeth. You are tasting a moving thing, and that is part of the comfort. It will keep changing without your permission, and you will keep agreeing with it without needing to explain why. The keeper sets your chopsticks down for you, a signal that the first taste has done its work. She gathers the bowls but leaves a small plate of radish on the table, a friendly door left half open. Your throat holds a thin line of warmth. Your cheeks feel colored by more than the lamp. Behind the calm of your chest, you can sense the cellar again jars thinking in silence, while you think in flavor. You bow to the table, not to be polite, but because the body wants to. The keeper answers with a bow small enough to count as a nod. The neighbor stands and tucks the pine sprig into the cord of a near jar as she passes, a neat wedge of green against brown. Whether the jar cares is not the point. The gesture steadies the hand that tied it. You step back from the low table and feel how the room has changed. It is no longer waiting. The first taste has become the first memory of this batch, pinned not by ink but by mouths. Later, someone will write the date on a tag and hang it from a cord. For now, the record is the simple fact that salt and leaf and time met, and that you were there when they introduced themselves. The afternoon air outside is brittle and pale. The sun stretched thin across the yard. You follow the keeper toward a row of shallow pits at the far edge, each covered with a neat thatch of straw and weighed down by stones. These are the burial beds, the jars that will spend the season under earth rather than sitting in the cellar. The keeper says the ground here remembers better than walls. It keeps its own even breath and does not care whether wind rattles the eaves. She kneels and begins to lift the straw cover from the nearest mound. The sound is crisp, like paper folding on itself, and the smell rises of dry grass warmed by a sun that has been absent for months. Beneath the straw is a mat of woven reeds, beaded with frost where the weave meets the shade. She peels it back to reveal a round lid flush with the soil, its edges traced by a faint ring of salt like a ghost of last summer's brine. A mainstream fact rests here in the dirt. Burying kimchi jars is not only a matter of storage, but of climate control. In winter, the earth holds its cold steadily, keeping fermentation slow and predictable. In summer, it keeps jars cool enough to prevent over-souring before their time. The ground is a quiet keeper, impartial and tireless. The lid you see is only the jar's crown. The body sleeps beneath, dark and full. The keeper takes a short-handled spade and begins to loosen the earth around the rim. The soil is soft from years of the same work, dark and sweet-smelling. She hums without realizing, a low vowel sound that seems to match the pace of the spade's bite. With each lift, the ring of the lid shows more clearly until she can grip the ear-like handles on either side. She twists gently, feeling for the seam to release. A fringe tidbit surfaces. In some valleys, The jars were marked with charms pressed into the earth above them. A pine cone for patience, a shard of blue glaze for clarity, a bent nail for stubbornness. Whether these had any effect beyond pleasing the eye of the one who buried them is left to guesswork, but the keeper admits she sometimes tucks a sprig of mugwort under the straw. It smells honest, she says, and the mice avoid it. Ense. She lifts the lid with both hands, revealing a surface dark and glossy in the muted light. The cabbage within lies pressed and still, its folds glistening with a brine that moves only when she leans close. A thin layer of ice is formed across one corner, delicate as spun glass. She cracks it with a fingertip, and it melts back into the liquid without protest. Historians still argue whether such surface ice harms the kimchi or merely delays its voice. Some claim it bruises the flavor, others swear it sharpens it. The keeper shrugs. It tastes like the ground kept it, she says, which is answer enough for her. You lean down and breathe in. The scent is deep and calm, the chili mellowed, the garlic low, the cabbage carrying the faint mineral breath of the earth. The brine is cool against your fingertip when you dip it in. It tastes older than the month, as if the soil lent it a memory from before it was sealed. The keeper takes a flat spoon and presses it gently into the jar's center, lifting a single fold of leaf. The texture is softer than the Cellars jars, the sour more settled, the heat slower to arrive but lingering once it does. She sets the lid aside on its edge and checks the rim for cracks. Clay buried year after year sometimes weeps a little salt into the soil. The ring of white around the jar's mouth is both badge and warning. This one is sound. She wipes it with a clean reed cloth and replaces the lid loosely while she works. Nearby, another mound waits. She points with her chin, and you move to help, brushing straw aside and feeling the frost bite your knuckles. As you uncover more lids, the pattern of the yard shows itself rows spaced for walking, each jar aligned so its handles face east and west. Some say this makes lifting easier. Others claim the orientation matters for flavor, though no one can agree why. Scholars note the practice but leave it in the column of unconfirmed. The keeper laughs when you ask. East to wake, west to rest, she says, as if that is all the reason anyone needs. One jar proves reluctant. Its lid is stuck fast, the seam hardened by a thin film of brine and soil. You rock it gently until it sighs free, revealing a brine darker than the rest. The keeper dips a fingertip, tastes and nods richer, she says, from cabbage that grew in the upper field where the soil runs heavier. You taste and agree without needing to know the science of it. The jars know their own differences. A small wooden ladle rests nearby, worn smooth from decades of use. The keeper says it belongs only to the buried jars. The Cellars jars have their own. She dips and fills a bowl for you, the liquid clear and bright in the pale sun. You drink, and the earth seems to follow the brine into your chest, steady, cool, unhurried. This is kimchi that has listened to stones all winter. When the sampling is done, the lids go back, the reeds are laid flat, the straw is spread evenly, and the stones return to their patient watch. You help press the covers into place, feeling how the yard becomes whole again once each mound is dressed. The keeper pats the last straw mat, as if tucking in a child. The air smells faintly of the ground, of salt, of old grass. A last uncertainty lingers, whether buried jars truly differ in flavor from those kept above ground, or whether the difference lives mostly in the mind of the one who digs them up. The keeper says both may be true. If you think it tastes better, it will, she says, and that's reason enough to bury it. You consider this as you walk back toward the house, the sun at your back, the earth still holding its quiet beneath your feet. You return to the house just as the light begins to lean toward evening. The cellar door stands open, and from inside comes the low shuffle of feet and the faint clink of glazed lids being moved. The keeper waves you in, her hands dusted with flour. It's the day for the top layer, she says, which turns out to mean the day when certain jars are opened, not for eating, but to press their contents down again so the brine sits where it belongs. You step into the cool, and the cellar's air wraps around you like a damp quilt. The keeper has placed a wide, shallow basin on the floor, lined with a reed mat. A small wooden mallet rests on the rim, and beside it lies a flat, circular stone wrapped in cloth. She kneels by the nearest jar, unties its cord, and lifts the lid with the care of someone waking a sleeping animal. The leaf inside rises just above the brine, its veins pale gold in the dim light. A few bubbles cling to the edges, moving slowly, as if deciding whether to leave. A mainstream fact hums here. Fermentation works best when the cabbage stays submerged. Air encourages mold, and mold means trouble. Even a small lift of leaf above the brine can invite it. So, once in a while, the jar must be tended pressed so that every fold rests below the surface again. The keeper dips her hands in a basin of warm water first, saying it's as much for the cabbage's comfort as for hers. She begins with her palms, pressing down gently, feeling the leaves give way under slow, steady weight. The brine sighs up around her fingers, darkening a shade as it rises. She turns her hands slightly, coaxing the stubborn edges into place. Then she takes the flat stone and lowers it onto the leaf, letting its weight settle without forcing. The stone sits just below the surface, holding everything down as though it means to keep a secret. A fringe tidbit emerges in the keeper's voice. Some households used smooth river stones for this work, chosen not only for weight, but for the sound they make when placed a muted clunk that was said to seal the flavor. Others swore by clay discs shaped by hand, often marked with a thumbprint so the jar remembered who had tended it. The cellar holds both kinds. The keeper says she likes the river stone for younger jars and the clay for older ones, though she can't tell you why beyond it feels right. Historians still argue whether the pressing was always part of the process or if it came later, as a refinement of taste and caution. Records mention salted leaves stored in brine, but not always the mid-season tending. Perhaps it began as a correction for jars that misbehaved, then became ritual for all. The keeper says she has never met a jar that didn't appreciate a firm, kind hand now and then. Once the stone is in place, she ladles a little fresh brine over the top to cover it completely. This brine is drawn from a jar kept solely for the purpose, salted water scented faintly with garlic skins, and a single chili pepper that floats like a bookmark. You don't want to water it down, she says, but you don't want to scold it either. You watch as she moves to the next jar. This one is older, the leaves darker and softer. When she presses, they sink with hardly a sigh, disappearing beneath the brine without complaint. She hums again, a small, looping tune, with no beginning or end. The sound joins the cool air and the faint scent of earth, making the cellar feel like a room that breathes. Your hands are invited next. The jar before you is wide-mouthed, the leaves inside springier than you expect. They push back a little, as if testing your resolve, but you lean in gently, letting your weight do the work. The brine rises in small, lazy rings before slipping over your knuckles. It is colder than the air, with a thickness that clings before it runs. You place the stone and feel the shift as the jar accepts it. The keeper nods. Like that, she says, you're telling it to rest. A small woven basket sits nearby, holding the lids that have been lifted. You notice each lid has a slightly different tone of glaze, some darker, some pale, and the brush marks of their making show faintly in the light. She chooses each lid carefully, setting it back so it matches the jar's mouth exactly. A misaligned lid, she says, lets the air think it can visit. By the time the last jar is pressed, your sleeves are damp and faintly scented with chili and garlic. The brine clings to your skin in a thin film, cooling as it dries. The cellar feels different now, quieter, as though the jars have been reassured. The keeper ties each cord with the same knot, snug but not choking, the ends trimmed evenly. She wipes her hands on a cloth that hangs from a peg, then drapes it back in its place. You both stand for a moment, looking over the rows. The lids gleam softly. The cords lie neat, and the stones rest hidden inside, doing their work without fuss. The air carries a faint tang of the fresh brine, but beneath it is the steady, slow scent of fermentation, continuing on its own time. Before you leave, the keeper dips a ladle into one jar and pours a small measure of brine into a cup. You sip. It is saltier than before, richer, as if the pressing has woken flavors that were dozing. It will sleep better tonight, she says. You set the cup down and feel a small, satisfying ache in your hands from the work. The cellar door closes with a soft wooden thud, leaving the jars in their cool, dim rest. Outside, the sun has folded itself low against the ridges, turning the yard the color of cooled brass. The keeper walks toward a line of low wooden racks set against the wall, each holding earthen crocks no bigger than your two hands cupped together. These are not for cabbage, she explains, but for the smaller ferments, the seasonings, and side companions that live alongside kimchi in the pantry's quiet corners. She lifts one croc's lid, revealing a dark paste flecked with seeds. Doenjang, she says, a soybean paste older than the current jars of kimchi by years. Another lid uncovers a looser, brighter sauce, gochujang, the chili paste whose heat has a rounder patience than fresh peppers. The smell rises warm and deep, carrying the same earth-salt voice as the cellar, but pitched in another key. A mainstream fact rests easily here. In traditional kitchens, ferments live in a kind of neighborhood, each lending something to the others. The jars in the ground, the crocks on the racks, the baskets of dried roots and leaves above together, they shape every broth, every side dish, every preserved leaf. To tend one is to tend them all. The keeper dips a short-handled spoon into the doenjang, showing its dense, grainy texture, then into the gochujang, which moves more slowly, clinging to the spoon as if reluctant to be set down. She offers you the barest taste on the tip of a wooden chopstick. The doenjang is salty first, then earthy, a kind of quiet hum that stays at the back of the tongue. The gochujang arrives slower, its sweetness and heat threading together until they feel like one thing. Neither overpowers, both feel like the kind of flavors that have nowhere to hurry. A fringe tidbit appears as she gestures to the racks. In some households, small crocks were tucked into the same pits as the kimchi jars during winter, not for temperature's sake, but so the flavors learned each other. Whether that exchange truly happened, or whether it simply pleased the keepers to imagine their ferment speaking in the dark, the practice has survived in certain valleys. She admits she does it still, slipping one crock in beside a jar each winter, for company. Historians still argue whether these smaller ferments began in households or in larger communal kitchens, then spread to homes. The records are thin. What survives are mostly tax lists and storeroom inventories, where quantities are noted but not origins. The keeper seems unbothered by the uncertainty to her. The crock's presence is as natural as the yard's frost. She moves down the line, checking each lid for a clean seal, then tilts one crock so you can see a faint bloom on the surface. It's harmless, she says, just a film that will be stirred back in. She stirs with an easy wrist, the paste folding in on itself like slow dough. The scent lifts sharper for a moment, then settles back into calm. From a hook on the wall, she takes down a bundle of dried peppers and shakes them gently so their seeds rattle inside. Some will be ground into powder to refresh the brine of certain jars. Others will be left whole and laid across the top leaves as a quiet guard against spoilage. You can smell their sun-dried warmth even in the cool air. She lays the bundle beside the crocks, and for a moment the reds and browns seem to talk in color. The racks themselves are worn smooth from decades of sliding crocks in and out. A few grooves in the woodmark where heavier jars have sat, year after year, in the same place. She says she could find them in the dark by touch alone. That, she adds, is part of the work, not just knowing how to make the paste or tend the jar, but knowing where each lives, how it feels under the hand, how its weight changes with the seasons. You lean against the wall, feeling the warmth that has gathered there from the afternoon sun. The crocks give off a faint, steady scent that settles in your chest. The keeper replaces each lid, pressing gently until the seal is sure, then dusts her palms together as if to say, the day's tending is nearly done. Before you step away, she opens one last crock at the far end of the rack. Inside is a pale, almost golden ferment salted shrimp, tiny and whole, their eyes still glinting faintly. The smell is sharp but not unkind. She says it's used sparingly, a drop of its brine here, a spoon of its body there, to deepen the jar's voices. A fringe belief claims that the first jar to receive it each winter will be the first to be emptied in spring. Whether that is true or simply a way of remembering which jar to watch, she doesn't say. You close the lid gently, and the shrimp disappear back into their cool, salted rest. The keeper smiles, satisfied that every lid is set, every rack in order. Outside, the last light falls across the yard, touching the straw-covered mounds one by one. Inside, the crocks wait in their shadowed row, patient as the jars, their work no less important for being quieter. The cellar mouth is a low oval of twilight, a place where two airs meet and shake hands. You stand at the threshold with the door propped open, letting the day finish its sentences in the yard. The light has gone thin and gold, threadbare at the edges, and the fields beyond the wall look like they have been combed smooth by a giant wooden rake. Smoke from cooking fires hangs in long gray ribbons that refuse to hurry anywhere. Everything seems to pause. People, paths, even the cat that has returned to sit like a dark comma on the sill. The cool air that rises from the cellar touches your face first, and then your sleeves, and then the knuckles of your hands. It carries the same layered voice you have worn all day, salt and leaf, clove of garlic, a memory of chili that has settled into friendliness. The yard's air answers with straw, a little ash, the faint sweetness of split firewood stacked under the eaves. You breathe once, then again, feeling the two scents overlap without quarreling. A mainstream truth keeps you at the door a moment longer. Evening is the keeper's favorite hour for checks. Heat has left the yard. Cold has not yet bitten hard. The jars in the earth and the jars under the roof are at their most moderate. Lids reseat more willingly. Cords accept the last touch without stretching or shrinking. If there was a flaw you missed in noon's glare, the slant light will tell on it now, a hairline of salt at a seam, a lid not sitting quite the way a lid should. You run your palm along 3 rims in turn and feel only steadiness. Shadows reach first for the straw-covered mounds. The straw returns the touch with a pale glow. Each thatch like a quiet animal curled to sleep. A magpie hops along the wall top, then loses interest and lifts away with a sound like silk torn carefully. Near your feet, the threshold stone is worn in a shallow curve from years of jars and shoulders passing in and out. You fit your heel into the curve without thinking and lean into the door lintel, which is polished where countless backs have rested after carrying too much. A fringe tidbit arrives with the lengthening dark. Some households face their cellar doors slightly away from the prevailing wind, not for drafts alone, but because the wind likes to gossip. If the door looks straight into it, they say, the jars grow talkative and refuse to settle. If the door faces a little aside, the wind must mind its manners. You glance at the hinge line and realize this door, too, is set a few degrees off. The day's breeze has been kind either way, but the idea pleases the mind that has spent a day listening for small causes. From the path comes the soft clop of hooves and the lower chuckle of cartwheels. A trader passes with a bundle of reed cord and a sack so white it can only be salt. He nods toward the open door in a way that suggests he approves of Cellars being allowed to breathe at day's end. You nod back, and both of you continue your separate keeping. Inside the mouth of the stair, the top steps reflect a faint bruise of blue left by the sky. Below, the light turns to brown, then to a friendly nothing. The wall's clay at shoulder height holds the day's last warmth, not heat, only an idea of it, and the chill rising from lower down is the same reliable cool you have known all afternoon. Historians still argue whether thresholds like this were once marked with charms or writing to bless the food below. The records show an occasional scrap of text, but not enough to make it a rule. Here, there is only a thin, thumb-smooth stone tucked at the jamb. It looks like the kind of object that has earned its right to be ignored. You listen, which by now is more reflex than intent. The cellar speaks in those small ways again, a tiny pop, a lid's almost their sigh, and the yard makes its own replies. A hen complaining on her way to the roost, a ladle ringing the lip of a pot, a child attempting a song she does not yet know. The two musics knit a quiet that is sturdier than silence. At the lintel, a paper tag flutters where it hangs from a peg, lifted by the faint exchange of air between dark and light. Its brushstrokes read, simply, "After frost." You notice it because you read the same phrase on a jar tag earlier, and because the evening seems to agree. The keeper steps up beside you and slides the tag a finger's width along the peg, as if resetting it for the next dusk. She does not explain. She has already taught you all day without naming the lessons. A bowl sits on the threshold stone, half filled with clear water. You saw it this morning and forgot it. Now you see its plain purpose. The keeper dips 2 fingers and touches each ear-like handle of the nearest jar lid. Dust learns manners, she says, by way of explanation. Whether the phrase is a proverb or only her own private sentence is uncertain. She wipes the handles with the hem of her sleeve and leaves the bowl for night to empty into air. Clouds gather along the western field line, like sheep that have decided to behave. The first star comes through above the pine, then 2 more that pretend they plan to be a pair. The yard cools by degrees so small they cannot be counted. You feel it in your teeth first, then on the inside of your wrists. The air that rises from the stair stays even, as promised. A scholarly uncertainty threads the moment. Exactly how much the cellar's breath changes across an evening like this. How the hours shift in temperature and pressure moves the minute bubbles. And the slow exchange through clay is the kind of question a careful mind might try to measure. Do the jars favor the gentleness of dusk? Or is that a story hands tell themselves to justify lingering at the door? Records do not bother. Instruments rarely visited rooms like this in the old days. The jars continue their work whether watched or not. And you, who have watched all day, decide the watching has been worthwhile regardless of proof. You think of all the small certainties that have stacked up between morning and now. Nuts tied flat, mats dried straight, brine judged, willing, stones placed so their weight feels like a conversation rather than an order. You think of all the small uncertainties that politely refuse to sit anywhere but at the edge of the mind. 7 pine nuts or 8, a charm of mugwort or none, a lid's thin grain of rice pressed at south or east. The evening holds both in easy balance. The keeper returns with an armful of split wood for the cooking hut. She pauses beside you and looks down the steps. They're quiet, she says, which can mean many things here. Content, properly sealed, sufficiently listened to, or simply not your problem until morning. She sets the wood against the wall and tucks a loose reed back into the thatch over the door in one practiced motion. A last, small errand. She lifts the cat briefly, an offended loaf of warmth, and sets it inside on a broad lid that has earned the privilege. Watch, she tells the animal, and to you she says, sleep. The cat blinks as if to acknowledge both commands. A fringe habit, perhaps, but nobody down here seems eager to correct it. You draw the door toward its frame. The hinge answers with a sound that has been getting ready all day to be this soft. The latch finds its notch like a thought that returns to its beginning. The evening and the underground agree on a boundary without dispute. At the last inch, you leave a thumb's width open, and the cellar sends you one final breath, cool and salted, which you take as the only thanks it will ever offer. Then you close it fully, and the mouth becomes wall again. The fields are almost gone to gray now. A window in the house shows the square of a fire and the round of a bowl. Your hands smell faintly of brine even after you rub them together. Each step away from the cellar feels like a thread unspooling that will be rewound at dawn. Behind you, under jars and straw and patient clay, winter continues its quiet tasks with the industry of things that do not need praise. You stand a heartbeat longer than necessary in the yard that is neither day nor night. Then you turn toward the hut's small heat and the bowl that waits, certain that the work is not finished, and also that, for now, no one is asking for more. Night settles over the courtyard like a bowl turned gently upside down. You return to the wall where the earthen breath is slow and even, and you lay a folded blanket on the packed floor just far enough from the cellar mouth to feel its cool without courting it. The sky above the eaves is a dark silk pricked with a few patient stars. The cat has chosen the lid again and begun its soft, intermittent purr. You close your eyes and listen as the yard trades day's edges for night's roundness. The jars below keep doing what they have done all day, what they will do through the season. Small bubbles gathering courage and slipping upward. Leaves relaxing under brine that knows exactly how to hold them. Cords remembering their knots. A mainstream fact settles over you like the blanket you've drawn up. Through winters, jars of kimchi have stood as reliable stores. Their keeping so central that seasons were planned around the salting days and the unsealing days, the harvest festivals and the quiet weeks when snow pressed the world into stillness and cellars became the larder's heart. You picture the marks on the jar, shoulders, moons, seeds, dots, gourds, and imagine the hands that pressed them, the fires that licked glaze into gloss, The rivers that rounded stones that now rest beneath brine. Somewhere in the wall, a faint tick announces a reed fiber drying. Somewhere in the mounds outside, a thin frost chimes when straw settles by a finger width. You breathe as the cellar breathes, and let your ribs learn the same measured work. A quirky thread returns unbidden. The thought that a rice grain tucked at the southern seam makes a year steadier, that a mat dried under a clear moon holds fewer complaints, that a jar watched by a cat naps better and wakes less fussy. You do not choose to believe or disbelieve. You only let the comfort of these small offers find a place beside the facts, the way pine nuts sit among leaves or perillo whispers through heat. Scholarly voices would still argue, even now, if you summoned them, exactly when chilies first stained these leaves red, precisely which valleys buried jars to tame summer, and which trusted only shaded rooms, whether old brine truly teaches new, or only flatters the hand that saves it. The debates are useful on paper, and you respect them. Here, they fall away to make room for taste, for the remembered feel of a knot pulled firm, for the soft clink of lid against rim when a circle is made true. You turn on your side and rest a palm against the packed earth. The cool is steady, not eager. It asks nothing and promises only what it can keep. The evening carries the faintest savor of garlic and something deeper, older, the mineral breath of clay and salt that have learned each other's company. Tomorrow, the same motions will return. A cord retied, a mat turned, a brine judged willing, a leaf pressed kindly home. The cat stretches, a lid answers with the smallest sigh. A breeze lifts, thinks better of it, and lies down again. The jar room beneath you gathers the day's stray threads and tucks them under its wide brown lids. Above, the stars mind their own ferment, distant, slow, content. You taste, on the back of your tongue, a ghost of brine from the first bowl, and it is enough to call this day complete. You do not wait for sleep. You simply loosen your hold on wakefulness, the way a leaf loosens its grip on brine. The cellar will keep, the jars will keep, the night will keep you both. The courtyard dims, until shapes are only suggestions. Straw as pale thoughts along the wall, jars as rounded pauses beneath the earth. You lie still, and let the air find its slow level. The day's work dissolves into small, simple fragments, the weight of a lid settling true, the cool thread of brine across knuckles, the soft crunch of bamboo mats leaning into sun. Each fragment lands and grows quiet. You think of the steady things. Clay that remembers hands. Salt that remembers sea. Leaf that remembers field and then agrees to become something else, patiently, without display. You breathe in, and the cellar answers with its familiar cool. You breathe out, and the reed curtain stirs once and rests. Let language loosen. Let measures become feelings. Enough, not too much. Firm, not tight. Warm, not hot. The knots on cords lie flat. The tags face outward. Stones hold their places like old friends who do not require talk. A cat becomes weight, then warmth, then only breath. The sky above the eaves is a gentle black. If there are stars, they do not insist. If there is wind, it minds its manners. The village sleeps in soft sections, a bowl set upside down, a ladle hung on a peg, coals thinking their red thoughts under ash. There is nothing to repair. There is nothing to rush. You let the day end again, more slowly this time. Jars keep winter at a polite distance. The earth holds its cool without effort. Your pulse learns the cellar's timing small, regular, unremarkable, exactly right. When your thoughts lift, let them drift back like leaves returning under brine. When they scatter, let a single, quiet word gather them. Keep. The lids shine faintly, and then not at all. The yard breathes once, and then forgets to hurry. Sleep follows the path the jars have set. Unforced, steady, kind. End of script. Sweet dreams.